The first rays of dawn broke through the weathered curtains of James Hargrove's bedroom. His eyes opened at precisely 0500 hours, just as they had every morning for the past 40 years, regardless of where he laid his head. 5 years into retirement, and the military clock still ticked inside him with unwavering precision. He stared at the ceiling for a long moment, listening to the familiar sounds of his Texas ranch coming to life around him. A rooster crowed in the distance. The old radiator in the corner clicked and hissed. Outside, the wind whispered through the live oak trees that surrounded his property. Hargrove swung his legs over the side of the bed, his joints protesting with a symphony of pops and creaks. 58 wasn't ancient, but 35 years of climbing in and out of tanks had left their mark on his body. He ran a calloused hand over his face, feeling the rough stubble beneath his fingertips. The face that stared back at him from the small mirror on his nightstand belonged to a stranger sometimes, lined and weathered by desert suns and midnight watches. Only his eyes remained unchanged, steel blue and sharp as ever. Another day above ground, he muttered to himself, a ritual acknowledgement of survival he'd carried since his first deployment. The small ranch house was modest but meticulously organized, a reflection of its owner. Hargrove moved through his morning routine with military efficiency, brewing coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in before settling at his desk in what had once been a dining room. Now it served as his office, dominated by a large oak desk facing the eastern windows. The walls around him told the story of a life dedicated to service, lined with shadow boxes of medals and photographs of men in desert camouflage standing beside massive armored vehicles. In one corner, mounted in a special case, hung the Distinguished Service Cross. Beside it, a faded photograph showed a younger Hargrove standing beside a sand-colored M1A1 Abrams tank in the Iraqi desert, the tank's massive 120-millimeter gun jutting proudly toward an endless horizon. 4 other men stood with him, arms draped over each other's shoulders, faces split with the peculiar grins of those who had seen combat and lived to tell about it. Only 3 of them had made it home. Hargrove opened his laptop and stared at the document that had consumed the past year of his life. His memoir, tentatively titled Iron Harvest, Reflections of a Tank Commander, currently stood at 342 pages of battlefield accounts, strategic analyses, and personal reflections from 3 decades of armored warfare. The cursor blinked accusingly at the end of a half-finished paragraph about his final deployment to Afghanistan. He sipped his coffee and began to type, describing the mountains of the Hindu Kush and the challenges they presented to armored vehicles. The words came easily when discussing tactics and terrain, but his fingers faltered when approaching the human element, especially when remembering that last mission, the one that still haunted his dreams after 5 years. The phone rang, jolting him from his memories. The caller ID displayed a number with a military prefix he recognized immediately. Hargrove, he answered, his voice automatically assuming the crisp tone of command. Jim, you old warhorse? Still answering like you're expecting a situation report? The familiar voice brought a rare smile to Hargrove's face. William Carter. I thought generals were too important to make their own phone calls these days. Not when calling the best damn tank commander the Army ever produced, General William Carter replied, the smile evident in his voice. How's civilian life treating you? Quiet, writing my memoirs like an old man. That book of yours might actually be worth reading, unlike most of the tactical garbage they're publishing these days. Carter paused. Listen, Jim, I'm calling because I need your expertise. Hargrove leaned back in his chair, eyes drifting to the wall of photographs. I'm retired, Bill. I know, and I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. We're running a major exercise at Fort Hood next week. Operation Red Horizon, most complex armored warfare simulation we've attempted in years. Hargrove said nothing, waiting for the general to continue. The exercise will simulate a border conflict scenario. We're fielding the new M1A2 Abrams with the System Enhancement Package, cutting-edge target acquisition, improved armor, the works. We've got drone integration, cyber warfare elements, and multi-domain operations all wrapped into one package. Carter's voice took on the enthusiastic tone of a man who loved his work. I need someone who understands armored warfare at a fundamental level. Someone who can evaluate whether all this new technology actually improves fighting capability or just complicates things. Hargrove rubbed his temple. You've got 1,000 active duty officers who could do that job. None with your experience. None who commanded tanks in 3 different conflicts. None who understand the soul of armored warfare like you do. Carter paused. Besides, there's something else you should know. The change in Carter's tone caught Hargrove's attention. Michael's unit is participating in the exercise. At the mention of his son's name, Hargrove felt a familiar tightness in his chest. Michael? He's commanding a recon unit for Blue Team. Seems he inherited your tactical mind, even if he did choose to be a scout instead of following his old man into tanks. Hargrove stood and walked to the window, looking out across his property to the distant hills. He hadn't spoken to Michael in almost 3 years. Not since that Thanksgiving dinner, when old wounds had reopened and bitter words had been exchanged. Words about priorities, about absences, about a mother who had waited for a husband perpetually deployed. What would I be doing exactly? He asked finally. Official title would be Special Tactical Advisor. You'd observe, evaluate, provide input on the exercise design. 1 week, that's all. Accommodations on base, full consultant's fee. Hargrove's eyes drifted to his laptop, to the blinking cursor waiting for him to confront memories he'd been avoiding for 5 years. When do you need me there? 2 days later, Hargrove drove through the gates of Fort Hood, the familiar weight of a military installation settling around him like an old uniform. His pickup truck, dusty from the country roads, seemed out of place among the pristine government vehicles. The MP at the gate had recognized his name immediately, straightening to attention as he checked Hargrove's ID against his clipboard. An honor to meet you, sir, the young soldier had said, a respect in his eyes that made Hargrove uncomfortable. He'd never sought to become a legend. He parked outside division headquarters, gathering his weathered leather briefcase before stepping into the Texas heat. The sprawling base hadn't changed much since his last visit. The same utilitarian buildings, the same carefully maintained grounds, the same sense of order and purpose that had defined most of his life. What had changed was his relationship to it all. For the first time, he was truly an outsider looking in. Inside the air-conditioned building, a captain intercepted him before he could check in at the front desk. Colonel Hargrove, Captain Roberts, sir. General Carter asked me to escort you directly to the briefing. The captain's eyes held the gleam of recognition. I studied your Fallujah tactics at West Point, sir. It's an honor. Hargrove nodded, uncomfortable with the admiration. Just Mr. Hargrove now, Captain. I've been a civilian for 5 years. Once a colonel, always a colonel, sir, Roberts replied with a grin, leading him down a corridor lined with unit photos and battle streamers. The briefing room buzzed with activity when they entered. Officers clustered around maps and computer displays, the air thick with the focused energy of preparation. Conversation quieted momentarily as heads turned toward the door, recognition rippling through the room. General Carter broke away from a group of senior officers and approached with an outstretched hand. Jim, damn good to see you. They shook hands, the firm grip of decades-long friendship. Carter had aged well, his trim physique and erect posture belying his 60 years. The stars on his shoulders sat naturally, as if he'd been born to wear them. Still running a tight ship, I see, Hargrove commented, nodding toward the organized chaos of the room. Trying to. Come meet the team. Carter led him through the room, making introductions. Colonels commanding the opposing forces, intelligence officers, logistics specialists, all regarding Hargrove with varying degrees of respect and curiosity. He noted the predominance of younger officers, men and women who had been children when he'd fought in Desert Storm. And this, Carter said, approaching a woman studying a topographical display, is Captain Sarah Miller, one of our most promising armored officers. The woman turned, her posture sharpening as she recognized Hargrove. In her early 40s, she carried herself with the confident competence of a career soldier. Colonel Hargrove, she said, extending her hand, your tactics lecture at Fort Benning changed my entire approach to armored warfare. Hargrove shook her hand, noting the firm grip. Glad to hear it helped. You command tanks now? 3rd Battalion, 66th Armor. We're fielding 12 of the new M1A2 SCP-V3 Abrams for this exercise. Pride colored her voice. They're incredible machines, sir. I'd like to see them in action. You will, Carter interrupted. Captain Miller's unit will be part of Red Team, which incidentally is the team you'll be advising. Hargrove raised an eyebrow. Red Team, I'm playing the enemy? Carter smiled. Who better to challenge our current tactics than the man who wrote half the tank doctrine they're using? Besides, I thought you might appreciate some distance from Blue Team's operations, considering he didn't finish the sentence, but Hargrove understood. Michael was with Blue Team. Carter was giving him space, a professional buffer between father and son. The briefing began shortly after, with officers gathering around a large digital display showing the exercise area. Hargrove found himself studying the terrain with the practiced eye of a tank commander. Rolling hills interspersed with wooded areas, several small creek beds that would challenge heavy vehicles, and a series of ridgelines offering excellent firing positions. The land bordered a small town called Liberty Falls, which would be partially incorporated into the exercise as an urban warfare component. Colonel Frank Marshall, a lean officer with salt and pepper hair, led the briefing. Operation Red Horizon simulates a cross-border incursion by hostile forces, he explained, gesturing to the map. Blue team represents our defensive forces, red team, the invaders. The exercise will test our ability to integrate new technologies and tactics in a multi-domain battle space. Hargrove listened as Marshall outlined the exercise parameters, noting with approval the complexity and realism built into the scenario. This wasn't just a tank versus tank engagement, but a full-spectrum operation incorporating infantry, air assets, electronic warfare, and civilian considerations. As Marshall described the disposition of forces, Hargrove found his attention drawn to a section of the map near the town. "What about this area here?" he interrupted, pointing to a valley that ran from the exercise boundary toward Liberty Falls. "It's a natural infiltration route, but I don't see any defensive positions marked." Marshall looked surprised. "That's outside the designated exercise boundary. There's an elementary school in that valley, so we've excluded it from the operation." Hargrove frowned. "In a real-world scenario, the enemy would exploit that gap. You've left Liberty Falls exposed from the southwest." "It's just an exercise constraint," Marshall replied, a slight edge to his voice. "We can't exactly run tanks through a school zone." "The enemy wouldn't hesitate to use that approach," Hargrove persisted. "At minimum, you should have observation posts and quick reaction forces designated to cover it." Carter cleared his throat. "Jim raises a good point. Let's adjust the scenario to include contingency plans for that sector. We're here to identify weaknesses, after all." Marshall nodded stiffly, making a note. Hargrove sensed the colonel's irritation at being challenged, especially by an outsider. But tactical oversights like this had cost lives in real combat. Better to ruffle feathers in an exercise than miss something critical when bullets were flying. The briefing continued, detailing the timeline, rules of engagement, and evaluation criteria. Red team would have 48 hours to establish defensive positions before blue team began their assault. The exercise would run for 5 days, with various scenario injections to test unit adaptability. As the meeting concluded, officers dispersed to their respective planning groups. Hargrove gathered his notes, sensing someone's approach. He looked up to find Sarah Miller waiting. "Colonel Hargrove, I am heading to the motor pool to inspect my tanks. Thought you might like to see what you'll be working with." Hargrove appreciated the gesture. "Lead the way, Captain, and please call me Jim. My commission expired half a decade ago." The walk to the motor pool gave Hargrove his first real glimpse of the base's activity. Soldiers hustled between buildings, vehicles moved along the roads, and the distinct sounds of a military installation in high gear surrounded them. It felt familiar, stirring memories both comforting and painful. "You served under General Carter in Iraq, right?" Miller asked as they walked. "2 tours. Bill Carter was the best battalion commander I ever knew. Understood the perfect balance between accomplishing the mission and protecting his people." Miller nodded. "He speaks very highly of you. When your name came up for this advisory role, he didn't hesitate." "We go back a long way," Hargrove said, leaving it at that. The bond forged between men who had faced death together required no elaboration. The motor pool sprawled before them, a sea of vehicles gleaming in the Texas sun. Mechanics swarmed over Humvees, Bradley fighting vehicles, and various support vehicles. But dominating the scene were the tanks. 12 M1A2 Abrams sat in perfect formation, their massive forms radiating lethal purpose. Even after all these years, the sight of an Abrams battle tank stirred something in Hargrove's chest. At 70 tons of composite armor and firepower, they represented the pinnacle of American land warfare capabilities. "Beautiful, aren't they?" Miller said, noting his expression. "They certainly are." Hargrove approached the nearest tank, running his hand along the smooth contour of the turret. This version was newer than the ones he'd commanded, sleeker somehow despite the additional systems. A sergeant climbed down from the turret, wiping his hands on a rag. He froze when he recognized Hargrove. "Colonel Hargrove? Holy shit, sorry, sir." The sergeant snapped to attention. Sergeant Pete Davidson, tank commander. At ease, Sergeant. Hargrove extended his hand. How's she handling? Davidson relaxed slightly, his face breaking into a grin. Like a dream, sir. The new targeting system can acquire and track multiple targets simultaneously, and the thermal imaging sees through just about anything. Show me. For the next hour, Hargrove immersed himself in the technical details of the upgraded Abrams. He climbed inside the familiar confines of the tank, settling into the commander's position as Davidson explained the new systems. The basic layout remained the same. Driver forward, gunner and commander in the turret, loader to the right, but nearly everything else had been enhanced or replaced. The targeting computer integrates with our battlefield network, Davidson explained, pointing to a display. We can receive target data from drones, other vehicles, even infantry with designated tablets. Gives us situational awareness like you wouldn't believe. Hargrove nodded, appreciating the advancement, while wondering if all this technology created new vulnerabilities. In his experience, the more complex the system, the more potential failure points. What about when the network goes down, he asked. Can you still fight effectively? Davidson hesitated. We train for degraded operations, but I'll admit, we've become pretty dependent on the tech. Make sure you keep those basic skills sharp, Sergeant. When everything goes to hell, you'll fall back on what's ingrained in muscle memory. Yes, sir. That's what our old-timers say, too. Old-timers? Hargrove suppressed a smile. That's what he was now. After thanking Davidson, Hargrove and Miller continued their tour of the motor pool. She introduced him to other tank commanders, each eager to show off their machines and ask questions about his combat experiences. Hargrove found himself warming to these young soldiers, recognizing in them the same dedication and pride that had defined his own career. As the afternoon wore on, they approached a different section of the base where lighter vehicles were being prepared. Scout Humvees and Bradley fighting vehicles lined up in formation, their crews performing maintenance checks. Hargrove's steps slowed as he spotted a familiar figure supervising a group of soldiers working on a modified Bradley. Even at a distance, he recognized his son. Michael stood taller than Hargrove remembered, his lean frame reminiscent of his mother. He directed his men with confident gestures, occasionally leaning in to inspect their work. Miller noticed Hargrove's change in demeanor. That's Lieutenant Hargrove's unit, she said quietly. They're the tip of Blue Team's spear, recon and forward observation. Hargrove nodded, uncertain whether to approach or retreat. The decision was made for him when Michael looked up and their eyes met across the yard. For a moment, neither moved. Then, with a brief word to his sergeant, Michael walked toward them. Time seemed to slow as his son approached. Hargrove noted the details a father notices after long absence. The new lines around Michael's eyes, the confident set of his shoulders, the wedding ring that hadn't been there at their last meeting. Colonel, Michael said formally, stopping a few paces away. His eyes flickered briefly to Miller before returning to his father's face. Lieutenant, Hargrove replied, matching his son's tone. Your unit looks well prepared. We try to be. Michael's voice was neutral, professional. I understand you're advising Red Team. That's right. An awkward silence stretched between them. There was too much to say, and no words adequate to begin. Captain Miller, Michael acknowledged with a nod. Your tank's ready for a beating? Miller smiled. Ready to give one, Lieutenant. Don't get too comfortable with your intelligence assessments. We might have a few surprises. I look forward to it. Michael glanced at his watch. If you'll excuse me, I need to complete these inspections before the briefing. Of course, Hargrove said. Good to see you, Michael. His son nodded once, then turned and walked back to his unit. No mention of family, no personal acknowledgement. Just the cold professionalism of two officers on opposing sides of an exercise. Miller waited until Michael was out of earshot before speaking. Family reunions can be tough. Hargrove appreciated her tact. We have our differences. He's highly respected, she offered. One of the best recon officers in the division. I'm not surprised. He was always observant, even as a boy. Memories flickered through Hargrove's mind, teaching 5-year-old Michael to identify different military vehicles. The boy's quick mind absorbing every detail. They continued their tour, but Hargrove's thoughts remained with his son. The gulf between them had begun years ago, widening with each deployment, each missed birthday, each school event Hargrove had sacrificed to the demands of his career. After Catherine's death, what remained of their relationship had crumbled under the weight of grief and recrimination. You chose the Army over her, Michael had shouted during that final Thanksgiving argument. Over all of us. And now you want to act like family matters? The words had cut deeply because they contained a measure of truth. Hargrove had loved his wife and son fiercely, but the call of duty had always pulled him away. When Catherine fell ill during his deployment to Afghanistan, he had requested leave but not insisted when his commander deemed the ongoing operation too critical. By the time he made it home, she was gone. Michael, then a West Point cadet, had never fully forgiven him. The irony wasn't lost on Hargrove that his son had chosen military service despite his resentment. Perhaps trying to understand his father, perhaps trying to prove he could do it differently. Either way, the Hargrove legacy of service continued, even as the family bonds frayed. Evening found Hargrove in the officer's mess, picking at a plate of food that tasted better than he remembered from his active duty days. The room hummed with conversation, officers discussing the upcoming exercise or catching up on unit gossip. He sat alone, content to observe from a distance. "Mind if I join you?" General Carter stood beside the table, tray in hand. At Hargrove's nod, he settled into the chair across from him. "How was your first day back in the saddle?" Carter asked, cutting into his steak. "Enlightening. You've got some impressive equipment and good people." "But?" Hargrove smiled slightly. Carter had always been able to read his reservations. "But I wonder if all this technology is making them soft. The sergeants I talked to seem more concerned with system maintenance than basic tank combat skills." Carter nodded thoughtfully. "It's a balance we struggle with. The modern battlefield demands technological proficiency, but we can't lose the fundamentals. That's part of why you're here, to remind everyone that war isn't won by computers." "I saw Michael," Hargrove said, changing the subject. Carter's expression softened. "I figured you might run into each other. How'd it go?" "About as well as expected. Professional, distant. Give it time, Jim. He's more like you than either of you want to admit." Hargrove grunted noncommittally. "Tell me about these contractors I've been seeing around. Private security types." Carter's expression shifted subtly. "Support personnel for the exercise. Logistics, site security, opposition, force augmentation. Standard practice these days. There's nothing standard about the way they carry themselves, or the way they're checking out our tank formations." Hargrove leaned forward. "Who's the older guy?" "Eastern European accent, about my age, moves like ex-military." Carter frowned. "Viktor Kozlov, heads the contractor team. Former military, as you guessed. His company provides realistic opposition training." "Which military?" Carter hesitated. "Russian army originally, but he's been in the U.S. for decades, worked with us on numerous exercises. His background gives our troops exposure to different tactical approaches." Hargrove said nothing, but the revelation unsettled him. During his last tour in Afghanistan, intelligence reports had highlighted the increasing presence of Russian military advisors working with various factions, often under the cover of private contractors. "You're giving him access to our newest tank variants?" Hargrove asked finally. "Limited access. Look, Jim, I understand your caution, but these people have been thoroughly vetted. Kozlov's company has contracts with half a dozen NATO countries." Hargrove nodded, deciding to drop the subject for now. But his instincts, honed by decades of combat, whispered caution. Something about Kozlov and his men didn't sit right. After dinner, Carter excused himself for a meeting, leaving Hargrove to his thoughts. Rather than return to his temporary quarters, he decided to take a walk around the base, reacquainting himself with the rhythms of military life. The evening air carried the familiar sense of diesel fuel and dust, overlaid with the distinctly Texan aroma of mesquite. Soldiers moved purposefully between buildings, some nodding respectfully as they recognized him. Hargrove walked without destination, letting his feet carry him along familiar paths. He found himself near the base perimeter, where the training grounds stretched into the distance. In the gathering darkness, maintenance crews worked under bright lights, preparing vehicles for the next day's operations. Among them, Hargrove spotted a cluster of men who didn't move like regular army personnel. Kozlov's contractors. He paused in the shadows, observing. 5 men surrounded a parked truck, speaking in low voices. Their posture suggested a private conversation, heads bent together conspiratorially. One man gestured toward the tank park visible in the distance, while another checked something on a tablet. As Hargrove watched, a 6th man approached the group. Even in the dim light, Hargrove recognized Viktor Kozlov from Carter's description. Tall and powerfully built despite his age, Kozlov moved with the measured precision of a career soldier. The group straightened at his arrival, their demeanor changing from casual to attentive. Kozlov spoke briefly, his words too distant to hear. Then he handed what appeared to be a small package to one of the men, who quickly tucked it inside his jacket. The group dispersed, moving with renewed purpose toward different areas of the base. Hargrove remained still until they had gone, considering what he'd witnessed. It could have been an innocent exchange, equipment distribution perhaps, or assignment details. But combined with his earlier misgivings, it left him uneasy. Deciding to follow his instincts, Hargrove tracked one of the men who headed toward the motor pool. Keeping to the shadows, he maintained a discreet distance, grateful for the ingrained fieldcraft that allowed him to move silently despite his age. The contractor stopped near the fence surrounding the tank park, ostensibly lighting a cigarette. But Hargrove noticed the man's attention focused on the guard patterns, the way his eyes tracked the movements of the MPs patrolling the area. After several minutes of observation, the man flicked away his cigarette and continued toward a storage building adjacent to the motor pool. Hargrove was about to follow when a voice spoke from behind him. "Bit late for a stroll, isn't it, Colonel?" He turned to find Captain Miller standing a few yards away, arms crossed over her chest. "Couldn't sleep," Hargrove replied, composing himself. "Old habits." Miller nodded, her expression suggesting she understood the restlessness that often plagued career soldiers. "I was just finishing some paperwork, heading back to quarters if you'd like company." Hargrove glanced toward the storage building where the contractor had disappeared, then back at Miller. The man would be gone by now, and pursuing him might raise questions Hargrove wasn't ready to answer. "Lead the way, Captain." They walked in companionable silence for a while, their path taking them away from the motor pool and toward the officers' quarters. "Something's bothering you," Miller observed eventually. Hargrove considered deflecting, but decided on a partial truth. "Just getting a feel for the operation. Standard practice before an engagement. Reconnoitering the battlefield," Miller said with a knowing smile. "Some things never change." "Some threats either," Hargrove replied, more seriously than he intended. Miller gave him a curious look. "You think Red Team has a legitimate chance in this exercise? Blue has twice our numbers and air superiority. Numbers and technology don't guarantee victory. History is full of superior forces defeated by better tactics or unexpected circumstances." Hargrove paused, then decided to probe gently. "What's your assessment of the contractor support, the Kozlov group?" Miller's expression shifted subtly. "Professional enough, keep to themselves mostly. Some of the NCOs don't like having civilians involved in military exercises, but that's the new reality." "You've worked with them before?" "Not directly. They showed up about 2 weeks ago for site preparation. Kozlov seems to know his stuff, especially regarding tank operations. Apparently he commanded armor units in Chechnya." The information confirmed Hargrove's suspicions about Kozlov's background. Russian tank tactics in Chechnya had been notably brutal, focusing on urban destruction rather than precision. "Has anything unusual happened since they arrived? Equipment issues, security incidents?" Miller slowed her pace, giving him a searching look. "Why the interest in the contractors, sir?" Hargrove weighed his response carefully. Without concrete evidence, voicing his concerns might seem paranoid, especially to a career officer accustomed to the modern military's reliance on private support. "Just gathering information, Captain. Part of my evaluation role." Miller seemed to accept this, though Hargrove sensed her reservations. "There was one odd incident last week. A small arms ammunition storage room showed signs of tampering. Nothing missing, according to inventory, but the lock had been forced. Military police investigated, but filed it as inconclusive." "Where was this?" "Building 347 near the northeast perimeter. It's been secured with additional measures now." Hargrove filed away the information, his unease growing. A reconnaissance of potential targets would fit the pattern of pre-operation planning. They reached the officers' quarters, stopping outside the building where Hargrove had been assigned temporary housing. "Thank you for the company, Captain," he said, "and the insights." "Anytime, sir. My team is running preliminary maneuvers at 0700 if you'd like to observe." "I'll be there." As Miller walked away, Hargrove remained outside, gazing across the darkened base. Something was happening beneath the surface of this exercise. Something Carter either didn't know about or wasn't sharing. Either way, Hargrove's combat instincts, the same ones that had kept him alive through 3 wars, were signaling danger. Rather than entering the building, he changed direction, heading toward the base exchange. If memory served, it would still be open, and he needed a few items that would raise no suspicions but might prove useful if his concerns materialized. 20 minutes later, he emerged with a small bag containing a flashlight, multi-tool, first aid kit, and prepaid mobile phone, basic precautions for a man who believed in contingency planning. As he walked back toward his quarters, the distant sound of engines caught his attention. Following the noise, he found himself near an access road that led to a rarely used training area. A convoy of 3 unmarked trucks moved slowly along the road, headlights dimmed to minimum illumination. Hargrove stepped behind a maintenance shed, watching as the vehicles passed. Through the open cab window of the lead truck, he caught a glimpse of Viktor Kozlov at the wheel. The trucks continued toward a section of the base that housed storage facilities for exercise equipment. Once the convoy had passed, Hargrove considered his options. Following them directly would be risky without knowing what he was walking into. But ignoring his instincts had never been his style, especially when potential threats loomed. Decision made, he circled around the main road, taking a parallel path that would bring him to the storage area from a different approach. The night had deepened, clouds obscuring the moon and casting the base into greater darkness. Perfect conditions for reconnaissance. Hargrove moved carefully, using the skills that had once made him an effective combat leader. Despite his age and civilian status, the military mindset returned easily, a familiar frame through which to view the world. Every shadow became potential cover, every sound a signal to process. The storage area appeared ahead, a collection of low buildings surrounded by chain-link fence. The 3 trucks had parked in a loading area, their rear doors open. Men moved purposefully between the vehicles, and a building marked "Exercise Materials, Authorized Personnel Only." Hargrove found a position behind a dumpster that afforded a view of the activity while providing adequate concealment. From his vantage point, he could see Kozlov directing the operation, gesturing towards specific crates being loaded onto the trucks. What caught Hargrove's attention wasn't the loading itself, which could be legitimate exercise preparation, but the careful way the men handled certain containers and the absence of any military personnel overseeing the work. For a high-security base, the lack of supervision seemed conspicuous. One of the men emerged from the building carrying what appeared to be a small metal case, which he handed directly to Kozlov. Unlike the other materials being loaded, Kozlov personally secured this item in the cab of the lead truck, locking the door afterward. Hargrove shifted position for a better view, inadvertently dislodging a piece of gravel that skittered across the pavement. The sound, barely audible to his own ears, nonetheless caused one of Kozlov's men to look up sharply. "Check the perimeter," Kozlov ordered, his accented voice carrying clearly in the night air. 2 men immediately broke away from the loading operation, moving toward the fence line with hands hovering near their waistbands. Hargrove remained perfectly still, controlling his breathing as one of the men approached his position. The man stopped less than 10 feet from the dumpster, scanning the darkness. Hargrove could see his face now, noting the hard eyes and the scar that ran from temple to jaw. Not the face of a typical logistics contractor, but that of a man accustomed to violence. After what seemed an eternity, the man turned away, rejoining his companion. They reported back to Kozlov, who nodded and directed them to complete the loading. Hargrove remained in place until the trucks were fully loaded and the men had secured the building. As they prepared to depart, he carefully memorized license plates and identifying features of the vehicles. Standard intelligence gathering, though he wasn't yet certain what he was investigating. The convoy pulled away, leaving the storage area quiet and dark. Hargrove waited several minutes to ensure they wouldn't return, then moved toward the building. The door had been secured with a padlock, unremarkable except for the fresh scratches around the keyhole that suggested recent tampering. Without tools to enter the building, where you going? And unwilling to commit a security breach without more substantial evidence, Hargrove decided to retreat and reconsider his approach. Whatever Kozlov was involved in, confronting it alone and unprepared would be foolish. He had just turned to leave when the crunch of gravel announced another presence. Before he could seek cover, a powerful flashlight beam caught him full in the face, temporarily blinding him. "Don't move," a voice commanded, "hands where I can see them." Hargrove complied, raising his hands slowly as he squinted against the light. "I'm unarmed," he said calmly. "Colonel James Hargrove, retired, special advisor to General Carter." The light lowered slightly, revealing 2 military police officers with sidearms drawn. Recognition flickered across the face of the senior MP as he holstered his weapon. "Colonel Hargrove, what are you doing out here, sir?" "Familiarizing myself with the exercise area," Hargrove replied smoothly. "I'm serving as an observer for Operation Red Horizon." The MP looked skeptical. "At 2300 hours? In an unauthorized area?" I found midnight reconnaissance provides the clearest picture of terrain and logistics, Hargrove said, maintaining his composed demeanor. Less distraction, more accurate assessment. The MPs exchanged glances, clearly uncertain how to handle a decorated retired colonel with apparent authorization from the base commander. We'll need to verify your status, sir, the senior MP said finally. Protocol. Of course. Hargrove retrieved his base ID, conscious that while he had legitimate access to the installation, his presence in this specific area at this hour would raise questions if reported. After examining his credentials and making a brief radio call, the MP seemed satisfied, if still confused. Everything checks out, sir, but this area is restricted after hours. For your safety, I'd recommend returning to authorized zones. Understood, Sergeant. I appreciate your diligence. Hargrove gestured toward the building. I noticed some activity here earlier. Civilian contractors loading trucks. Is that standard procedure? The senior MP frowned slightly. Not typically after hours, sir, but there's been a lot of unusual movement with the exercise preparations. We've been told to give the contractor teams wide latitude. By whom? Orders came through Colonel Marshall's office, said they're essential personnel for the opposing force setup. Hargrove nodded thoughtfully. Marshall, who had seemed irritated by his tactical suggestions during the briefing. Thank you for the information, Sergeant. I'll head back now. The MPs escorted him to the main road, maintaining a respectful but watchful presence until he was clearly en route to the officers' quarters. As he walked, Hargrove processed what he'd learned. Kozlov's team operating with unusual autonomy, Marshall providing cover, suspicious handling of unidentified materials. None of it definitive, but together forming a pattern that raised red flags for a man who had spent decades evaluating battlefield threats. Back in his temporary quarters, Hargrove sat at the small desk and began making notes in a personal shorthand he'd developed years ago. Facts, observations, questions, all organized to reveal patterns or inconsistencies. An old intelligence-gathering habit that had served him well in combat zones, where distinguishing friend from foe often meant the difference between life and death. After completing his notes, he secured them inside his briefcase and prepared for bed, setting his alarm for 600. Tomorrow would bring the official start of Red Team's preparation phase, and with it, opportunities to gather more information about both the exercise and Kozlov's activities. Sleep came slowly, his mind replaying the evening's observations alongside memories of Michael's cold greeting. Father and son, separated by years of absence and recrimination, now opposing forces in a simulated battle. The symbolism wasn't lost on Hargrove as he finally drifted into uneasy slumber. He woke before the alarm, his body responding to decades of military discipline. After a quick shower and shave, he dressed in the civilian attire he'd brought for the advisory role, khaki pants and a button-down shirt, practical but distinct from uniforms. A visual reminder of his current status. The officer's mess was already bustling when he arrived for breakfast. He filled a tray with eggs, toast, and black coffee, then sought a quiet corner to observe the room. Officers gathered in small groups, discussing the day's objectives or catching up on personal matters. The atmosphere buzzed with the focused energy of professionals preparing for a challenge. Captain Miller spotted him and approached with her own breakfast tray. Mind if I join you, sir? Please. Hargrove gestured to the empty chair across from him. Sleep well? She asked, settling into the seat. Well enough. He sipped his coffee, studying her over the rim. Your team ready for today? As ready as we'll ever be. First phase is defensive positioning along the northern ridgeline. We've got a natural choke point that should force Blue Team to commit their armor in predictable vectors. Her eyes lit up as she discussed tactics, revealing a genuine passion for armored warfare. If we can establish interlocking fields of fire from positions with good hold-down capability, we might actually give your son's team a run for their money. Hargrove appreciated her enthusiasm. Don't underestimate the value of mobility over fixed positions. An Abrams that stays still too long becomes a target, regardless of its armor. Sound advice, a new voice interjected. Victor Kozlov stood beside their table, a tray of food in his hands. Mind if I join this discussion of tank tactics? It's a subject close to my heart. Hargrove tensed internally but maintained an outward calm. Mr. Kozlov, I presume? You presume correctly, Colonel Hargrove. Kozlov set his tray down and extended a hand. Your reputation precedes you. 3 wars, 12 confirmed tank kills. The legendary flanking maneuver at Fallujah. A true master of armored warfare. Hargrove shook the offered hand, noting the powerful grip and the calluses that spoke of recent weapons handling rather than desk work. You seem well informed about my record. I make it my business to study the best, Kozlov replied, taking a seat. Up close, Hargrove could see the man more clearly, mid-50s, with steel gray hair, cropped short, and eyes that revealed nothing. A jagged scar ran along his right forearm, disappearing under his rolled sleeve. When I learned you would be advising Red Team, I reviewed your publicly available service history. Impressive career. And yours? Hargrove asked directly. General Carter mentioned Russian army experience. Kozlov smiled thinly. Among other things, primarily Eastern Europe and the Caucasus, but that was long ago. Now I help train NATO forces, providing realistic opposition scenarios. He turned to Miller. Captain, your tank commanders performed admirably in yesterday's preliminary drills. Good crew coordination. Thank you, Miller replied, her tone professional but guarded. Your opposition force personnel have been helpful in setting up the exercise parameters. Kozlov nodded, then returned his attention to Hargrove. I'm particularly interested in your thoughts on modern tank warfare, Colonel. Has technology fundamentally changed the principles, or do the old truths still apply? The question seemed innocuous, but Hargrove sensed an underlying purpose. Testing his knowledge, perhaps, or probing for specific tactical insights. The fundamentals remain, Hargrove answered carefully. Firepower, protection, and mobility. Technology enhances these elements but doesn't replace the need for skilled crews and sound tactics. Precisely my view, Kozlov agreed. In Chechnya, I saw Russian tanks with superior technology falter because crews lacked basic skills. A lesson I've never forgotten. The conversation continued, with Kozlov asking questions about specific engagements and tactics. Hargrove responded with general principles, avoiding operational details that might reveal sensitive information. Throughout, he studied Kozlov, noting the man's deep knowledge of tank warfare and his particular interest in American counter-IED measures and reactive armor systems. After 20 minutes, Kozlov checked his watch and stood. Duty calls. A pleasure meeting you, Colonel. Perhaps we can continue this discussion later. I'd value your perspective on the evolution of anti-tank weapons since your Iraq deployments. After Kozlov departed, Miller leaned forward. He seems particularly interested in your expertise. More than seems appropriate for an exercise contractor, Hargrove agreed quietly. Captain, what do you know about last night's activities at the storage facilities near the East Perimeter? Miller's expression showed surprise. Nothing specific. Why? I observed Kozlov's team loading materials after hours. No military oversight, handling equipment with unusual security measures. He paused, deciding how much to reveal. It may be nothing, but it struck me as irregular. Miller considered this. I can make some discreet inquiries. Several of the senior NCOs have expressed reservations about the contractor presence. I'd appreciate that. Meanwhile, I'll continue my official role with Red Team planning. Hargrove finished his coffee. Which reminds me, we should head to the command post. The defensive phase briefing starts in 20 minutes. They walked together to Red Team headquarters, a converted administrative building now bustling with planning activity. Maps covered the walls, computers displayed terrain models, and officers clustered around tactical displays discussing options. Colonel Marshall nodded curtly as Hargrove entered, his manner suggesting lingering irritation from yesterday's exchange. The morning passed in detailed planning sessions, with Hargrove offering occasional input on defensive positioning and counter-reconnaissance measures. His suggestions, drawing on decades of experience, were met with varying degrees of receptiveness. The younger officers seemed eager for his insights, while some of the senior staff appeared resistant to advice from an outsider, regardless of his credentials. By midday, Red Team had formalized their initial defensive strategy. They would establish primary positions along a ridgeline overlooking the main approach routes, with secondary positions in a fruit orchard that provided excellent cover and fields of fire. Mobile reserves would remain concealed in a valley behind the ridge, ready to counter any breakthrough. As the officers dispersed to implement the plan, Hargrove found himself alone with Colonel Marshall, who was studying the terrain model with a furrowed brow. Something troubling you, Colonel? Hargrove asked. Marshall straightened. Just considering contingencies, Blue Team has significant advantages in reconnaissance capabilities. Maintaining operational security will be challenging. Your concern is valid, Hargrove acknowledged. In Iraq, we found that excessive radio communication often compromised our positions more than physical signatures. Marshall nodded reluctantly. We've implemented encrypted communications and signal discipline protocols. But with the integration requirements of modern systems, complete emissions control is nearly impossible. Then use it to your advantage, Hargrove suggested. Create a deception plan. Let them detect what you want them to see while concealing your true dispositions. Marshall considered this. Not a bad idea. We could position decoy heat signatures to draw their initial reconnaissance while keeping our main force under thermal blankets. He paused, seeming to wrestle with professional pride before continuing. I apologize if I seemed dismissive yesterday. This exercise represents a significant evaluation point in my career trajectory. Hargrove appreciated the man's honesty. No apology necessary. We're all focused on making this a valuable training experience. He hesitated, then decided to probe gently. I understand you've granted Kozlov's team special access authorizations. Marshall's expression tightened. That directive came from Division G3. Apparently, their role in simulating opposing force capabilities requires unusual latitude. Not my preference, but I follow orders. Of course. Hargrove nodded, filing away this new information. The authorization had come from higher than Marshall, suggesting broader institutional approval of Kozlov's activities. The afternoon took Hargrove to the field, observing as Red Team began establishing their defensive positions. He rode with Captain Miller in her command Humvee, visiting each tank position as crews prepared fighting positions and camouflage. The work was familiar, reminiscent of preparations he'd overseen in Kuwait before Operation Iraqi Freedom. Soldiers dug hull-down positions, established ammunition points, and rehearsed fire control procedures. Despite his civilian status, Hargrove found himself slipping into a command mindset, evaluating each position with the critical eye of a combat leader. Your third tank is exposed from this angle, he pointed out to Miller as they inspected the orchard position. If Blue pushes reconnaissance through that draw, they'll spot your flank before you can engage. Miller studied the terrain, then nodded. You're right. We'll reposition to that cluster of trees and improve the camouflage. She spoke into her radio, directing the tank commander to adjust. Hargrove watched as the massive Abrams reversed from its position, treads churning the soft earth as it moved to the new location. Even after all these years, the sight of a main battle tank maneuvering with precision still impressed him. You miss it, don't you? Miller asked quietly, observing his expression. Parts of it, Hargrove admitted. The clarity of purpose, the bond with your crew, knowing exactly what's expected of you. He paused, looking across the training area where dozens of soldiers worked with focused determination. But not the cost. Never that. Miller nodded understanding. As they continued their inspection, Hargrove spotted a group of Kozlov's contractors on a nearby hillside observing the tank placements through binoculars. Their presence, while ostensibly part of the exercise, heightened his unease. As evening approached, they returned to base for the daily after-action review. Officers gathered to discuss progress and adjust plans for the following day. General Carter attended briefly, expressing satisfaction with the preparations before departing for other commitments. After the formal meeting concluded, Hargrove found himself drawn into conversation with several junior officers eager to hear about his combat experiences. He shared selected stories, emphasizing lessons learned rather than glorifying the violence of war. These young men and women would face their own tests someday. Better they approach combat with realistic expectations than romantic notions of heroism. As the group dispersed, Hargrove noticed Miller in conversation with a senior non-commissioned officer near the door. She caught his eye and gave a subtle nod, suggesting she had information to share. Outside the building, Miller fell into step beside him. Sergeant Major Winters confirmed unusual activity at Building 347 last night, she said quietly. Kozlov's team removed several crates marked as exercise equipment, but the paperwork doesn't match standard issue items. Any idea what was in the crates? Nothing specific, but Winters mentioned something else concerning. A weapons maintenance specialist reported several firing pins missing from the armory 3 days ago. Initially logged as inventory error, but never resolved. Hargrove processed this information. Firing pins would allow conversion of exercise weapons to live fire capability. Combined with the ammunition storage tampering Miller had mentioned earlier, a troubling pattern emerged. Who else knows about this? Just Winters and a few trusted NCOs. They're keeping it quiet until there's more concrete evidence. Accusations against a contractor with high-level authorization could backfire without solid proof. Hargrove nodded agreement. We need to tread carefully. For now, maintain normal operations but increase vigilance. I'll speak with General Carter when appropriate. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of a young lieutenant. Captain Miller, Colonel Hargrove, he said, saluting. General Carter requests your presence at his quarters immediately. Exchanging concerned glances, they followed the lieutenant across the base to Carter's temporary housing. The general met them at the door, his expression grave. Come in, he said, ushering them inside. Once the door closed, he turned to Hargrove. Jim, we have a situation. Security picked up unauthorized surveillance equipment near our tank positions. Sophisticated stuff, not standard exercise monitoring. Hargrove felt his suspicions solidifying into certainty. Kozlov? No direct evidence yet, Carter replied, but the timing and placement suggests someone with intimate knowledge of our operations. He looked troubled. What concerns me more is that several communication systems experienced unexplained failures during today's deployment. Engineers found evidence of tampering. Sabotage, Miller said softly. Potentially. Carter moved to a small table where a map of the base was spread out. We've increased security around critical assets, but discreetly. If this is some kind of test of our countermeasures, I don't want to show our hand too early. Hargrove studied the map, noting the locations Carter had marked where anomalies occurred. These aren't random, he observed. They're concentrated around command and control nodes. Someone's mapping our communication infrastructure. My assessment as well, Carter agreed. Which brings me to why I called you here. Jim, I want you to continue your advisory role as cover, but keep your eyes open. Your experience and outsider perspective might spot things my regular personnel would miss. Hargrove nodded, recognizing the delicate position. What about Kozlov's movements? We're tracking them, officially as part of exercise security. So far, nothing conclusive, but enough to warrant concern. Carter turned to Miller. Captain, your unit will maintain normal operations, but I want increased security on your tanks. Verification checks before each movement. No unescorted contractors near the vehicles. Understood, sir. Carter checked his watch. I have a secure call with Division in 10 minutes. Keep this conversation between us for now. If this is a genuine security threat, I don't want to tip off the perpetrators. If it's just overzealous exercise play, I don't want to create unnecessary alarm. As they left Carter's quarters, Hargrove felt the weight of combat readiness settling over him once more. The familiar tension of knowing danger lurked nearby, but remaining uncertain of its exact nature or timing. I'm heading to the officers' club for a drink, he told Miller. Care to join me? She shook her head. Need to brief my platoon leaders on the new security measures. Rain check? Of course. Good hunting, Captain. Hargrove walked alone toward the officers' club, his mind cataloging what he knew and suspected. Kozlov's team had access to sensitive areas, unusual latitude from higher headquarters, and demonstrated interest in specific military capabilities. Equipment tampering, surveillance devices, and irregular movement of unidentified materials all pointed to something beyond standard exercise opposition. The question remained, what was their actual objective? Intelligence gathering seemed likely, but the pattern suggested preparation for direct action. The proximity to Liberty Falls added a civilian dimension that particularly troubled Hargrove. If Kozlov had ulterior motives, the town and its residents could become collateral damage. Lost in thought, Hargrove almost missed the figure watching him from the shadows near the club entrance. As he approached, the man stepped forward, revealing himself as Sergeant Frank Winters, the NCO Miller had mentioned. Colonel Hargrove, Winters said quietly. Got a moment, sir. There's something you should know. Hargrove nodded, following the sergeant to a quiet corner of the parking lot where they wouldn't be overheard. Captain Miller mentioned you've been asking questions about Kozlov's group, Winters began. I've been keeping an eye on them since they arrived. Something's not right with those boys. What have you observed, Sergeant? 3 nights ago, I was running a night equipment check when I spotted 2 of them near the ammunition storage. They claimed to be lost, but they had bolt cutters in their vehicle. Winters lowered his voice further. Next day, I noticed they'd moved equipment into Building 215, which isn't part of the exercise footprint. When I checked the requisition logs, there was no record of authorized access. What kind of equipment? Hard to say for certain. Heavy cases, secured with more locks than typical exercise gear. One looked like a specialized communications setup. Another could have been weapons components, based on the handling. Winters hesitated. Sir, I served 3 tours in Afghanistan. I know what men preparing for combat look like versus those playing at exercises. These guys have the real deal vibe. Hargrove considered the sergeant's observations, which aligned with his own suspicions. Have you reported this officially? Tried to, sir. My company commander said division has granted them special authorization for realistic opposition scenarios. Told me to stay in my lane. Frustration edged Winter's voice. But 20 years in uniform teaches you to trust your gut, and mine's screaming something's wrong. I appreciate you bringing this to my attention, Sergeant. Keep observing, but maintain a low profile. If you notice anything else unusual, contact me directly. Hargrove provided Winters with his temporary quarters number and the prepaid phone he'd purchased. After Winters departed, Hargrove continued to the officers' club, his concerns deepening. The evidence was circumstantial but mounting. Whatever Kozlov planned, it appeared to be building toward execution during the exercise itself, when unusual activity would be masked by the general chaos of simulated combat. The officers' club was sparsely populated, with most personnel either on duty or resting before tomorrow's operations. Hargrove ordered a whiskey and found a quiet table where he could observe the room while organizing his thoughts. He had just taken his first sip when a familiar figure entered the club. Michael stood in the doorway, scanning the room before his eyes settled on his father. For a moment, he seemed to consider leaving, but then straightened his shoulders and approached. "Colonel," he said formally, stopping beside the table. "Mind if I join you?" Hargrove gestured to the empty chair, surprised but cautious. "Please." Michael ordered a beer from a passing server, then settled across from his father. An uncomfortable silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken grievances and regrets. "Your recon unit ready for tomorrow?" Hargrove asked finally, defaulting to professional conversation. "As ready as we'll ever be." Michael studied his father's face. "Word is you've been asking questions about the contractor team." Hargrove raised an eyebrow. "News travels fast. Small base, big ears." Michael leaned forward. "Listen, I'm not here to rehash old arguments, but I've noticed some strange activity with those contractors too. My scouts reported unusual movement near the western perimeter last night. Equipment transfers outside normal exercise parameters." "You reported this?" "To my chain of command, yes. They noted it but didn't seem particularly concerned. Said it was part of the opposition force setup." Michael frowned. "But it doesn't match any exercise scenario I've seen before." Hargrove considered his son's information, which corroborated the pattern he'd been tracking. "What's your assessment?" "Professional instinct says something's off. These guys move differently than regular contractors, more coordinated, more situationally aware." Michael hesitated. "One of my sergeants recognized one of them from a previous deployment. Claims he was private security in Syria, with rumors of Russian intelligence connections." The revelation added another layer to Hargrove's concerns. Russian intelligence operating under contractor cover would explain the level of sophistication and interest in American military capabilities. "I appreciate you sharing this," Hargrove said carefully. "I've had similar observations." Michael nodded, a fragile moment of professional respect bridging their personal divide. "Whatever our differences, we're both soldiers. If there's a threat to our people or this mission, personal issues take a back seat." For a brief moment, Hargrove saw not the estranged son, but the dedicated officer Catherine would have been proud of. "Agreed. For now, maintain normal operations but increase your security protocols. I'm pursuing some inquiries that may clarify the situation." Their conversation shifted to tactical matters, discussing the upcoming exercise phases with the detached professionalism of officers preparing for operations. Yet beneath the surface, Hargrove sensed a tentative reconnection, a shared purpose that transcended their fractured relationship. As Michael prepared to leave, he paused. "Mom always said your biggest strength and worst flaw were the same thing. You never stop being a soldier, even when you're trying to be something else." He met his father's gaze directly. Maybe she was right. With that, he departed, leaving Hargrove to contemplate his son's words and the uncertain threat looming over Fort Hood. Tomorrow would bring the official start of Operation Red Horizon, with Blue Team beginning their offensive operations against Red Team's prepared positions. But Hargrove suspected the real battle would unfold in the shadows, against an adversary with objectives far removed from the training scenario. As he finished his whiskey and prepared to return to his quarters, one certainty crystallized in his mind. Whatever Kozlov planned, innocent lives potentially hung in the balance. The skills that had kept James Hargrove alive through 3 wars whispered a familiar warning. Combat was coming not in the controlled environment of a military exercise, but in the chaotic reality of an enemy with hidden objectives. And despite his retired status and civilian clothes, He would soon find himself back in the commander's position, making decisions that determined who lived and who died. The irony wasn't lost on him. After 5 years of trying to leave war behind, war had found him once again. And this time his son stood in the path of whatever storm approached. Dawn broke over Fort Hood with military precision. James Hargrove stood outside his quarters, steaming coffee, warming his hands in the early Texas chill. The first rays of sun glinted off distant vehicles as the base stirred to life. Today, Operation Red Horizon would transition from planning to execution. His thoughts turned to Michael. Their brief connection the previous night, professional, guarded but real, had formed a tentative bridge across years of silence. Not reconciliation, but perhaps a first step. A formation of Apache helicopters passed overhead, their silhouettes dark against the brightening sky. Blue Team assets running early reconnaissance. Somewhere beyond those hills, Michael and his scout unit would be preparing their own mission, the vanguard of Blue Team's offensive. Hargrove returned to his quarters and changed into earth-toned civilian clothes suitable for fieldwork. The prepaid phone went into one pocket, his notebook of observations about Kozlov encrypted in personal shorthand into the other. Precautions from decades of combat experience that warned him something was wrong. Captain Miller waited outside, combat fatigue sharp, hair pulled tight beneath her patrol cap. "Morning, sir. My tanks moved into final positions during the night. The orchard is secured, ridgeline nearly complete." "Any incidents?" Hargrove asked as they walked to her Humvee. Miller's expression tightened. 2 tank commanders reported communication disruptions. System diagnostics showed nothing wrong. She lowered her voice. "Winters left a message. Kozlov's team was moving equipment near our secondary positions at 200. When challenged, they produced authorization paperwork signed by Division G3. Hargrove processed this as they reached the vehicle. "They're building a profile of our tank communication systems. Standard procedure before an electronic attack." "But why?" Miller asked, navigating a dusty access road. "This is just an exercise." "Unless the exercise isn't their primary objective." They drove in silence, the landscape opening around them. The training area stretched for miles, rolling hills, wooded areas, small valleys cutting through rocky outcroppings. In the distance stood Liberty Falls, its church steeple and water tower rising above the countryside. Miller parked at a command observation post overlooking the defensive positions. Abrams tanks sat in hold-down positions along the northern ridgeline, their massive turrets just visible over carefully prepared earthworks. Camouflage netting broke up their outlines. In the orchard to the east, trees in neat rows offered both concealment and channelization. "Excellent positioning," Hargrove commented, studying the layout through binoculars. "Your gunners have clear lines to all likely approach routes." "We've incorporated your mobility suggestions," Miller replied. "Each position has at least 2 pre-planned alternates. If Blue detects one position, we can relocate before they bring effective fire." Hargrove's attention lingered on the southwestern approach, the valley near Liberty Falls he'd identified as a weakness. "What coverage do you have for the school valley?" "Limited. We positioned scouts on the ridge, but we're restricted from heavy weapons near the school." Inside the Tactical Operations Center, officers huddled around communications equipment. Displays showed Red Team elements, updated in real time. Colonel Marshall nodded as they entered. "Colonel Hargrove, just in time. Blue Team has launched reconnaissance elements. Multiple drone signatures approaching our northern perimeter." Hargrove studied the tactical display. Blue markers representing UAVs moved in a search pattern, probing for gaps in Red Team's coverage. "Standard procedure," he observed. "They'll map your defensive positions, looking for blind spots and approach routes that minimize exposure." "We're feeding them false signatures," Marshall replied. "Decoy heat sources in secondary positions, while our actual strength remains concealed under thermal blankets." It was solid counter-reconnaissance, a strategy Hargrove had employed in past operations. Keep the enemy guessing until too late for adjustment. "What about electronic countermeasures?" Hargrove asked. "If they detect your communication patterns, they can track command vehicles regardless of physical camouflage." Marshall gestured to a signals officer. "Lieutenant Reyes has implemented rotating frequencies and burst transmission protocols." Reyes looked up from his console. "We've also created dummy traffic patterns from secondary locations. If they track our communications, they'll find decoys, not command nodes." "One concern," Reyes added, his expression troubled. "We've detected anomalous signals since 0400. Doesn't match any Blue Team electronic warfare profile. We're trying to isolate the source." Marshall dismissed this with a wave. Probably civilian interference from Liberty Falls. Hargrove caught Miller's skeptical look. Civilian signals would have consistent patterns, not targeted disruptions. May I? Hargrove asked, gesturing to Reyes's station. The lieutenant moved aside. Hargrove examined the frequency logs, looking for patterns in the disruptions. These aren't random, he said. They're focused on command and control frequencies, particularly those used by armored units. And they're probing, not jamming, testing for responses, mapping your protocols. Exactly what I thought, Reyes agreed. But it's outside exercise parameters. Blue Team isn't supposed to begin electronic warfare until 1400 hours. Have you reported this? To Colonel Marshall, yes. Hargrove straightened, turning to Marshall. Colonel, this bears investigation. If someone is conducting unauthorized electronic warfare, it's being handled, Marshall interrupted. Division is aware of the anomalies. They're tracking it as part of a separate evaluation exercise. The explanation seemed plausible, but Hargrove's instincts said otherwise. Multiple unauthorized activities, all conveniently attributed to separate evaluations, formed a pattern too coherent to dismiss. Outside, Miller spoke freely. Marshall's dismissing concerns too easily. First security breaches, now electronic anomalies. Either he's under orders to ignore these incidents, Hargrove said, or he's deliberately overlooking them to avoid complications during his command evaluation. Or he's involved, Miller suggested quietly. Keep an open mind, but focus on what we know. Kozlov's team is conducting unauthorized reconnaissance of our positions and communications. They're handling equipment that doesn't match exercise parameters, and they have unusual latitude from someone in Division G3. They reached the orchard as morning sun filtered through apple trees. The sweet scent of fruit mingled with diesel exhaust in disturbed earth. Tank crews improved their positions, digging deeper hold-down emplacements and reinforcing camouflage. Sergeant Davidson approached, wiping grease from his hands. Captain Miller, Colonel Hargrove, we're at 90% readiness. 2 more hours and all positions will be fully prepared with alternate firing locations. Any issues to report? Miller asked. Davidson hesitated. 2 of Kozlov's contractors were examining our positions around 0300. Said they were checking camouflage effectiveness as part of their opposition role. Did they touch any equipment? Hargrove asked sharply. Not that we observed. My gunner kept eyes on them, but they seemed particularly interested in our communications. Asked about frequencies and protocols. From now on, no unescorted contractors near your vehicles, Miller ordered. If they need legitimate evaluations, they'll have an officer present. Davidson led them to his Abrams, nestled between apple tree rows. The position was expertly prepared, hull partially recessed into earth, leaving only the turret visible. Camouflage netting incorporated natural materials from the orchard, making the massive tank nearly invisible until it opened fire. Distant helicopter rotors grew louder. 2 Black Hawks approached from the main base, flying low before turning toward Liberty Falls. Those aren't exercise aircraft, Miller observed. Different markings. VIP transport, Hargrove suggested. Someone observing from town? Miller's radio crackled. All Red Team elements, this is command. Blue Force reconnaissance approaching southern perimeter. Estimated 2 mechanized scout platoons with drone support. Maintain camouflage discipline. Do not engage unless directly compromised. As they drove toward the observation post, Hargrove noticed Kozlov's contractors establishing what appeared to be a forward command post near the southwestern valley. That's outside the operational plan, Miller noted. Support elements are supposed to remain at designated logistics points behind our lines. They altered course, taking a perimeter road that brought them closer without direct approach. 3 large trucks had positioned near trees overlooking the valley. Men moved between vehicles, unloading equipment and establishing a perimeter. That's a command post configuration, Hargrove observed. Forward observation and communication relays. Why position it overlooking an area outside exercise boundaries? Unless they're interested in Liberty Falls, not our defensive positions, Miller concluded. As they passed, Hargrove studied the setup through peripheral vision. The equipment didn't match exercise support gear. More concerning was a case being transferred between trucks. The distinctive shape of a man-portable missile system container. A contractor approached, raising his hand for them to stop. This area is restricted. Authorized personnel only for opposition force activities. Captain Sarah Miller, Red Team, she replied professionally, conducting perimeter inspection. Your position wasn't on the exercise overlay. Last-minute addition, the man said, Eastern European accent less pronounced than Kozlov's. Authorized by Division for Specialized Electronic Warfare Simulation. After driving clear, Miller spoke. That wasn't exercise equipment. No, Hargrove agreed grimly. Those were real weapon systems. Anti-tank missiles. Miller's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. We need to report this to General Carter. Carefully, Hargrove cautioned. If Kozlov has high-level authorization, raising alarms prematurely could alert them. At the observation post, Blue Team's reconnaissance elements approached Red Team's northern perimeter. Bradley fighting vehicles moved cautiously along ridge lines, accompanied by dismounted scouts using terrain for concealment. Marshall tracked the movement through binoculars. Blue Team is being cautious. Methodical approach, good terrain masking. Your son is leading them well, Colonel. Hargrove's chest tightened at the mention of Michael. Have they probed the southwestern approach? Negative. As expected, they're avoiding the restricted zone near the school. Marshall lowered his binoculars. Division sent confirmation of a special electronic warfare element operating there, part of a separate evaluation outside the main exercise. When did this directive come through? Hargrove asked carefully. This morning, standard procedure for multi-layered exercises. The timing was convenient, authorization arriving just as they'd discovered the suspicious position. I need to make a call, Hargrove said, stepping away. Technical question for a specialist at base. Moving out of earshot, he used the prepaid phone to call Winters. It's Hargrove. Need you to relay information to General Carter, securely and in person. We've confirmed unauthorized weapons at the southwestern position. Anti-tank systems, real. Also, someone in Division is providing cover for Kozlov, routing authorization through G3. Understood, Winters replied. I can reach him through a secure channel. Have him check the flight authorization for 2 Blackhawks that flew to Liberty Falls this morning. Non-standard markings. Will do. What's your location? Red Team observation post overlooking northern positions. The pieces connected in Hargrove's mind. Kozlov's interest in tank positions and communications, anti-tank weapons near Liberty Falls, unmarked helicopters, all pointed toward an operation targeting armored units, using the exercise as cover. What remained unclear was the ultimate objective. Simple sabotage seemed too limited for such preparation. Intelligence gathering was another possibility, but the presence of actual weapons suggested more direct action. A sudden explosion echoed across the training area, not a controlled exercise simulator, but an actual high-explosive round. A plume of smoke rose from where Kozlov's vehicles had been moving. What the hell? Marshall demanded, grabbing his radio. All Red Team elements, hold positions. Weapons tight, do not engage. Another explosion sounded closer. The radio erupted with confused reports of unauthorized vehicles and detonations across the training area. Blue Team is pulling back, Miller reported, establishing defensive positions. This isn't the main event, Hargrove realized. These are diversionary actions, drawing attention while the real operation develops elsewhere. A vehicle approached at high speed. Sergeant Winters jumped out and hurried toward them. Colonel Hargrove, General Carter sent me. We've got a situation. We're aware, Marshall interrupted. Unauthorized detonations across the training area. That's not the primary concern, Winters replied, addressing Hargrove. Intelligence confirmed Kozlov is former GRU, Russian military intelligence, commander of a special operations tank unit in Chechnya and Syria. What's his objective? Hargrove asked. 30 minutes ago, the governor of Texas arrived in Liberty Falls for an unannounced school visit. 2 Blackhawks, civilian markings. The pieces clicked with cold clarity. The governor is the target. They're creating a crisis that allows access to a high-value political target. An assassination during a military exercise. Marshall paled. The political fallout would be catastrophic. General Carter arrived with military police. Colonel Marshall, you're relieved pending investigation. These MPs will escort you to base for questioning. Marshall's face flushed with shock. General, what is the meaning of this? We have an emergency situation, one facilitated by authorization from your office. Carter replied coldly. Authorization for Kozlov's team to operate outside normal parameters, access secure areas, in position near Liberty Falls. I was following directives from Division G3, Marshall protested. There were no such directives. The authorization documents were forged using credentials linked to your command systems. Hargrove watched with grim understanding. Marshall hadn't been actively complicit. He'd been manipulated. Kozlov had exploited bureaucratic seams, using forged authorizations to establish his operation. Captain Miller, you have tactical command of Red Team, Carter ordered. Implement emergency protocols and secure a perimeter around Liberty Falls. Carter turned to Hargrove. Jim, we need your expertise. We have actual combat vehicles operating within our training area. At least 3 modified strikers plus support vehicles. They're creating diversionary attacks while moving reinforcements toward Liberty Falls. Where's the governor now? Hargrove asked. At the elementary school, scheduled there another hour before departing. We've tried contacting his security detail, but communications are jammed. The entire valley has gone dark. Kozlov's establishing isolation around his target, Hargrove said. The scattered attacks draw our response away from Liberty Falls while creating confusion about what's real and what's exercise. We have reinforcements en route, but they're 30 minutes out. By then, Kozlov could accomplish whatever he's planning. Hargrove studied the tactical display. Red Team's tanks were positioned primarily north, defending against the expected Blue Team attack. Repositioning them would take time, especially with confusion throughout the training area. What about Blue Team assets? They've withdrawn to defensive positions per safety protocol. Carter's expression was grim. Michael's reconnaissance unit is closest to Liberty Falls, but they're equipped for scouting, not assault. Hargrove's chest tightened at the mention of his son. We need armor support to counter those strikers. Miller turned from organizing her units. I have 3 tanks at the southern orchard edge. They could reach Liberty Falls in 15 minutes. Do it, Carter ordered. Warn them they'll be facing actual threats, authorized for live ammunition and real engagement protocols. We need better intelligence before committing those tanks, Hargrove cautioned. Sending them blind could play into Kozlov's hands. Michael's reconnaissance unit, Carter suggested. If they're already near Liberty Falls, they can provide eyes on target while remaining concealed. Can you coordinate with them? Hargrove hesitated only briefly. Yes, sir. I'll need secure communications and transport to a forward position. Take my vehicle, Winters offered. It's equipped with secure comms that bypass the exercise networks. As they drove toward the ridge line overlooking the southwestern valley, Hargrove spotted a cluster of vehicles in concealed positions. Michael's reconnaissance unit maintaining observation while awaiting orders. Michael emerged from behind a Bradley, surprise evident as he recognized his father. Colonel, he greeted formally. What's happening? We've got reports of actual explosions across the training area and unauthorized vehicles moving toward Liberty Falls. The situation has changed, Hargrove replied. This is no longer an exercise. We have confirmed hostile forces with a likely objective in Liberty Falls. He briefed Michael on Kozlov, the governor's presence, and the developing response. Michael listened intently, expression shifting from confusion to focused determination. We've observed 3 modified strikers moving toward town, he reported. They've established checkpoints on main roads and appear to be jamming communications. Standard isolation procedure for a high-value target operation. Have they moved against the school yet? Negative. They're establishing a perimeter first, ensuring no response forces can interfere. Michael hesitated. We're not equipped for direct engagement against armored vehicles. My Bradleys have TOW missiles, but only 2 launchers operational. We don't need you to engage directly, Hargrove explained. Captain Miller is sending 3 Abrams from the southern orchard. They'll provide the necessary firepower. What we need is detailed intelligence on enemy positions and movement. Michael nodded. I have 2 observation posts with clear lines to the school and main approaches. We've been mapping enemy movement since they appeared. He showed Hargrove a tactical display on a ruggedized laptop. Their main element is here, command post in this building with clear sight lines to the school entrance. 2 strikers positioned here and here, covering main access roads. The 3rd striker is mobile, patrolling this perimeter. Hargrove studied the display, processing angles of approach, fields of fire, and potential civilian presence. Any indication they have identified your observation posts? Negative. We're maintaining strict emissions control and visual discipline. Hargrove coordinated with Miller's approaching tanks, giving them specific targeting data based on Michael's intelligence. Suddenly, an urgent call came from one of the observation posts. Lieutenant, movement at the school. They're escorting the governor outside. Looks like they're preparing to depart. Through binoculars, Hargrove saw figures moving near the entrance. Security personnel surrounded a central figure as they moved toward waiting vehicles. If they're planning to hit the governor, it will be during the transfer, Hargrove assessed. Classic vulnerability point. But something doesn't add up, Michael replied. If assassination was the objective, they could have struck already. The governor's been at the school over an hour. Unless the objective isn't assassination, but capture, a high-value American political figure would be an unprecedented intelligence coup. The implications were staggering. Not just an attack on American soil, but an attempt to capture a sitting governor for political leverage or intelligence exploitation. The tanks won't arrive in time to prevent initial contact, Michael noted, checking his watch. Movement near the command building caught their attention. Armed men emerged, moving with the coordinated precision of Special Operations Forces. Unlike the contractors observed earlier, these men wore tactical gear and carried military-grade weapons. 8 tangos moving toward the school perimeter, Michael reported. Standard assault formation. They're going for the governor. Hargrove made a quick decision. We can't wait for the tanks. Your Bradleys have 2 missiles. Can you get a clear shot at the strikers from here? Michael assessed the angle and distance. Affirmative for the 2 stationary vehicles. The mobile patrol is currently obscured by buildings. Target the stationary strikers. Eliminate their fire support before the assault team reaches the governor. Michael nodded, relaying orders to his missile teams. The Bradley gunners aligned their TOW missile launchers on the distant striker vehicles. Weapons free. Fire when ready. The distinctive launch sound of a TOW missile cut through the air. The weapon streaked toward its target, covering the distance in moments before striking the first striker. A flash of light followed by black smoke confirmed a direct hit. A second missile launched, striking the remaining stationary striker. The unexpected attack created momentary confusion among Kozlov's forces as the assault team paused, looking toward their disabled support vehicles. Now move your Bradleys to supporting positions. We need to maintain pressure until the tanks arrive. Through his binoculars, Hargrove watched the governor's security detail react to the nearby explosions, hustling their charge back toward the building while establishing a defensive perimeter. Kozlov will adjust, Hargrove predicted. He's committed now and can't abort without compromising his entire team. The mobile striker appeared from behind buildings, its turret swiveling toward the reconnaissance unit's position. The vehicle commander had identified the source of the missile attack. Incoming, Michael shouted as the striker fired its heavy machine gun. Rounds impacted the ridgeline around them, forcing everyone to take cover. We need tank support now, Hargrove radioed Miller. Enemy striker engaging our position with heavy weapons. Governor security holding at the school, but under threat from enemy assault team. 2 minutes out, Miller replied. Tank engines audible in the background. Request final targeting data. Hargrove provided coordinates while Michael organized his Bradleys to provide suppressing fire, forcing the enemy striker to maneuver defensively rather than advance on the school. Governor security is moving him to a different building, Michael reported during a brief lull, breaking the enemy's prepared assault plan. The distant rumble of approaching tanks grew louder. 3 Abrams appeared on the southeastern ridgeline, taking hold-down positions that maximize firepower while minimizing vulnerability. The lead tank's main gun elevated, tracking the enemy striker. A flash followed by the distinctive boom of a tank cannon announced the Abrams' entry into battle. The 100mm round struck the striker with devastating effect. With their armored support eliminated, Kozlov's assault team found themselves exposed and outgunned. The Abrams tanks established a blocking position between the enemy forces and the school, machine guns providing suppressing fire that forced the attackers to seek cover. They're pinned down, Michael observed. Nowhere to go with the tanks controlling the approaches. Keep your units alert, Hargrove warned. Kozlov himself is still unaccounted for. Suddenly, a civilian helicopter rose from behind the school, its approach masked by buildings until directly overhead. Not one of the Blackhawks that had brought the governor, but a smaller commercial model apparently waiting nearby. Extraction vehicle, Hargrove identified. They're adapting the plan. We need air defense, Michael said urgently. Your Bradley's TOW system, can it track an aircraft? Michael understood immediately. Not designed for it, but at this range with a hovering target, it's possible. Target the helicopter before it can land. Without extraction, Kozlov has no endgame. The remaining missile team adjusted their launcher. The TOW launched, arcing toward the helicopter. For a heart-stopping moment, it appeared the missile would miss as the pilot attempted evasive maneuvers. At such close range, even limited mobility wasn't enough. The missile struck the helicopter's tail section, sending it into an uncontrolled spin. The pilot managed to veer away from the school before crashing into an empty field. Without extraction and with their armored support destroyed, Kozlov's operation had unraveled. The assault team began falling back towards secondary positions, maintaining covering fire as they withdrew. They're breaking contact, Michael reported, heading northwest toward those commercial buildings. Maintain observation. Miller's tanks should establish a perimeter around the school. Our primary objective is securing the governor. As Michael coordinated with Miller, Hargrove updated General Carter on the situation. Governor secure, enemy vehicles neutralized, primary extraction compromised. Hostile forces withdrawing toward commercial district. We've established tank coverage around the target location. Well done, Carter responded. Military police and regular army reinforcements are 5 minutes out. FBI counterterrorism en route as well. Any sign of Kozlov himself? Negative. He may be directing from a secondary position. We need to capture him if possible. The political implications extend far beyond what happened today. Michael approached with an update. We've spotted what appears to be their command element moving to vehicles behind the commercial district. 4 individuals, one matching Kozlov's description. We need to intercept them. Can your fastest Bradley get into blocking position on the northwestern access road? Affirmative, I'll lead it myself. Before Hargrove could respond, Michael was already moving toward his command vehicle, issuing orders to his crew. Hargrove coordinated with Miller's tanks. We have possible identification of Kozlov attempting extraction via Northwest Commercial District. Lieutenant Hargrove is moving to intercept with 1 Bradley. Request 1 tank to reinforce. Tank 3 diverting to support, Miller replied. Hargrove watched through binoculars as Michael's Bradley sped toward the intercept point. The years of estrangement faded, replaced by immediate concern for a soldier and son moving into danger. The Bradley reached the intersection moments before a civilian SUV appeared. The armored vehicle swung broadside across the road, its turret tracking the approaching vehicle. The SUV skidded to a halt. For several tense seconds, neither vehicle moved. The SUV's doors opened, and 4 men emerged, weapons raised. Hargrove recognized Kozlov among them, directing his men to take covering positions. They're going to fight, Hargrove realized, reaching for the radio to warn Michael. Before he could transmit, gunfire erupted as Kozlov's team opened fire on the Bradley. The armored vehicle returned fire with its 25mm chain gun, the powerful weapon tearing into the civilian vehicle, forcing the attackers to scatter for cover. Miller's tank arrived, effectively trapping Kozlov's team between 2 armored vehicles. Kozlov, recognizing the hopelessness of his position, made a desperate move. Separating from his team, he sprinted toward a nearby building. Michael saw the movement and made a split-second decision. Instead of firing the Bradley's weapons, which risked civilian casualties in nearby buildings, he ordered his driver to reposition, blocking Kozlov's path while he personally dismounted to pursue on foot. Hargrove's breath caught as he watched his son emerge from the Bradley, pistol drawn, moving tactically toward the building where Kozlov had disappeared. Miller, this is Hargrove, he radioed. Lieutenant Hargrove is pursuing Kozlov on foot. Need immediate infantry support to secure the perimeter. Hargrove and Winters raced to the intersection. Arriving at the perimeter established by Miller's tank, Hargrove quickly briefed the military police commander, directing forces to establish a secure cordon around the building. Kozlov is cornered but dangerous, he emphasized. Lieutenant Hargrove pursued him into the building alone. Hargrove checked his borrowed sidearm and turned to the Bradley crew. I'm going in to provide backup. The crew sergeant nodded. We've got your back, sir. Hargrove approached the building cautiously, using cover and concealment as he'd done countless times in combat zones. Age might have slowed him slightly, but decades of experience guided his movements with an efficiency that compensated for any physical decline. Inside, he found himself in a dim hallway with offices branching off to either side. A faint noise from above suggested movement on an upper floor. He located a stairwell and ascended silently, pausing at the top to listen. Voices came from down the hallway, one Michael's, the other carrying Kozlov's distinct accent. They were talking, not fighting, suggesting a standoff rather than direct confrontation. Hargrove moved toward the sound, staying close to the wall and using doorways for cover. The voices became clearer as he approached a conference room at the end of the hall. It's over, Kozlov, Michael was saying. The building is surrounded. Your team is captured or neutralized. There's no extraction coming. Perhaps, Kozlov replied calmly. But tell me, Lieutenant Hargrove, do you understand what you've interrupted today? Do you comprehend the larger game being played? I understand you attempted to attack or capture the governor of Texas during a military exercise. That's enough to know you need to surrender now. A dry chuckle. So American. So focused on the immediate tactical situation without seeing the strategic implication. Your father would understand. He always had a broader perspective than most of your military commanders. The mention of himself gave Hargrove pause. Kozlov had specifically identified Michael by name and relationship. This operation had been planned with detailed intelligence, about the units involved in the exercise, including personal information about key personnel. Hargrove reached the doorway, positioning himself to see inside without being immediately visible. Michael stood at one end of a long table, pistol trained on Kozlov, who sat casually in a chair at the opposite end. The Russian appeared unarmed, hands visible on the table's surface. "Perhaps you should ask your father to join us," Kozlov said, looking directly toward the doorway. "I know he's there." Former tank commanders develop an instinct for when they're being watched. Hargrove stepped into view, his weapon trained on Kozlov. Michael's expression registered momentary surprise, then professional acknowledgement as his father took position beside him. "Viktor Kozlov," Hargrove said, "former GRU Special Operations Commander in Chechnya and Syria, long way from home. Colonel James Hargrove, your reputation in armored warfare is well known, even in Moscow. 3 wars, 12 confirmed tank kills, the tactical mind behind the Fallujah flanking maneuver. I studied your operations extensively." "Flattery won't improve your situation," Hargrove replied evenly. "Your operation has failed. The governor is secure. Your forces are neutralized. You have nowhere to go." "Perhaps." Kozlov leaned back, remarkably relaxed for a man facing capture. "But sometimes, Colonel, the apparent objective isn't the true mission. Sometimes the operation itself, successful or not, serves a greater purpose." The implication sent a chill through Hargrove. "You wanted us to stop you. The operation was designed to be discovered and countered." A thin smile spread across Kozlov's face. "Consider the result. American military forces firing live ammunition during a scheduled exercise. Armored vehicles engaging in combat near civilian populations. A sitting governor endangered. The political fallout alone will generate investigations, recriminations, policy changes. And somewhere in that chaos, the real objective is accomplished," Hargrove concluded grimly. "Create enough smoke, and no one notices the actual fire until it's too late. Today's events will dominate headlines and consume political attention. Meanwhile, other operations elsewhere proceed unnoticed." A red laser dot appeared on Kozlov's chest, a sniper from the response force, establishing a shot. Kozlov glanced down with resigned amusement. "It appears our conversation must conclude, Colonel. A pity. We could have discussed much of professional interest." "Surrender now," Michael ordered. "Hands behind your head, on your knees." For a moment, Kozlov considered his options. Then, with deliberate slowness, he began raising his hands. Instead of placing them behind his head, he reached into his jacket. "Don't!" Hargrove warned sharply. Kozlov paused, meeting Hargrove's gaze with professional understanding. "We both know how this ends, Colonel. Men like us don't retire peacefully. We serve until we fall. The only choice is how we meet that moment." His hand continued its movement, producing not a weapon but a small flash drive, which he placed on the table. "For you, Colonel, a professional courtesy. The complete intelligence file on today's operation, including its authorization chain in connection to other active measures. A window into the larger game." Before either Hargrove could respond, Kozlov's other hand moved with lightning speed, producing a small pistol concealed in his sleeve. But he didn't aim at either of them. Instead, he placed the barrel against his own temple. "For Russia," he said simply, and pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the room as Kozlov slumped forward, his final act denying them the intelligence that could have unraveled the full scope of the operation. Michael moved quickly to secure the weapon and check for vital signs, though the outcome was unmistakable. Hargrove stood motionless, processing what had occurred. Kozlov had chosen death over capture, not from fear of interrogation, but as a calculated final move in whatever strategic game he served. The flash drive represented both a clue and a question. What information had he deemed worth sharing, and why? As military police secured the scene, Hargrove picked up the flash drive. The day's events had prevented a potential catastrophe, but Kozlov's final words suggested they had only seen one piece of a much larger operation. Michael approached, holstering his weapon. He chose to die rather than face capture. "He completed his mission," Hargrove corrected. "Whatever the true objective, his role was finished. This," he held up the flash drive, "is either his final deception or a rare glimpse of truth." They stood together amid the aftermath of violence, father and son momentarily united by the professional understanding that came from facing death and making impossible decisions. The personal gulf between them remained, but something fundamental had shifted. "You did well today," Hargrove said simply. Michael nodded, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. I had a good teacher, once upon a time. Outside, the military and law enforcement response filled the air as the immediate crisis transitioned to investigation and recovery. The governor was safe, the attack thwarted, the immediate danger contained. But as Hargrove pocketed the flash drive and prepared to brief General Carter on Kozlov's final revelations, he couldn't shake the feeling that they had won only the first skirmish in a much longer conflict. As they exited the building together, the afternoon sun illuminated a changed landscape, not just the physical terrain of Liberty Falls, marked now by the evidence of unexpected combat, but the personal territory between father and son. They walked side by side, neither fully reconciled nor completely estranged, but moving forward with a new understanding forged in the crucible of shared danger. The battle was over. The tanks had done their job, their massive firepower deterring further aggression and securing the safety of innocents. But the war, both the shadowy conflict Kozlov had alluded to and the more personal struggle within the Hargrove family, continued on multiple fronts, with victories and losses yet to be determined. The Pentagon's hallways always seemed longer at night. James Hargrove walked alone, his footsteps echoing against polished marble floors, the sparse emergency lighting casting long shadows ahead of him. 3 weeks had passed since the Liberty Falls incident. 3 weeks of debriefings, classified testimonials, intense meetings with intelligence officials who circled around the core questions without ever directly addressing them. The flash drive Kozlov had given him with his dying breath sat in a secure facility somewhere, its contents analyzed, dissected, and likely buried beneath layers of national security classifications. Hargrove had been granted only partial access to the findings, enough to understand that Kozlov's operation had indeed been part of something larger, but not enough to see the full picture. At 2130 hours on a Tuesday night, the Pentagon should have been largely empty, operating on skeleton staff. Yet Hargrove had received an urgent message from General Carter requesting his immediate presence in a secure conference room. The message mentioned no reason, only that it concerned development related to Liberty Falls. Hargrove reached the designated room and paused outside the reinforced door. A biometric scanner glowed blue beside the frame. He pressed his palm against it, waiting as the system verified his identity and clearance. The door slid open silently, revealing a dimly lit room dominated by a large table. General Carter sat at the far end, his face illuminated by the glow of a laptop screen. Beside him sat a woman Hargrove didn't recognize, mid-50s, sharp features, wearing a tailored suit that radiated government authority. 2 military officers flanked them, their rank insignia identifying them as Army intelligence. Colonel Hargrove, Carter greeted standing. Thank you for coming on such short notice. General, Hargrove nodded, approaching the table. Your message sounded urgent. It is. Carter gestured to the woman beside him. This is Director Catherine Hayes, Defense Intelligence Agency. She's been leading the analysis of the material we recovered from Kozlov. Hayes didn't stand, merely offering a curt nod. Colonel, your actions at Fort Hood likely prevented a significant geopolitical crisis. But it appears what happened there was merely the opening move in a much more complex operation. Please sit, Carter said, indicating a chair across from them. Hargrove complied, noting the tension in the room. Whatever had prompted this late-night meeting wasn't routine follow-up. Hayes tapped a few keys on her laptop, activating a wall display that filled with a series of images and documents. What I'm about to share is classified at the highest level. Your temporary security clearance has been elevated specifically for this briefing. The display showed what appeared to be an organizational chart, names, photographs, and connection lines forming a complex web of relationships. At the center was a name that made Hargrove sit straighter. Colonel Anton Baranov, Russian GRU. Kozlov's superior officer, Hayes explained, noting Hargrove's reaction. Based on the intel from the flash drive and subsequent analysis, we've determined that Baranov is running a sophisticated operation codenamed Razlom, Russian for fracture. Liberty Falls was just one component. The objective? Hargrove asked, studying the display. Strategic destabilization, Carter replied grimly. Creating precisely timed incidents that appear unrelated but collectively undermine public confidence in military and civilian leadership. Hayes nodded. The flash drive contained operational plans for 3 coordinated actions. Liberty Falls was the first. The second would have targeted a naval exercise off the Carolina coast next month. The third, she paused, her expression darkening, Involves a tank brigade currently deploying to Poland for NATO exercises. Hargrove absorbed this information, the implications crystallizing. Michael's brigade. Yes, Carter confirmed. Your son's unit ships out in 72 hours as part of Operation Atlantic Shield. They'll be operating less than 30 miles from the Russian border. According to Kozlov's files, Baranov has assets in place specifically tasked with targeting this deployment. What kind of assets? Hargrove asked, military instincts already calculating potential threats to armored units in that theater. Hayes changed the display to show satellite imagery of the Polish-Russian border region. We've identified 3 possible teams. Former Special Forces operators, similar to Kozlov's group, operating under commercial cover. They've been positioning equipment and personnel near the exercise areas for the past month. The concerning part, Carter added, is that we still haven't identified all of Baranov's inside sources. Kozlov had legitimate authorization documents at Fort Hood because someone in our chain of command provided them. We have to assume similar compromises exist within the NATO command structure. Hargrove studied the imagery, recognizing the tactical significance of the terrain where Michael's unit would be operating. The region featured rolling plains interspersed with dense forests and small villages, challenging conditions for armored operations, with numerous potential ambush points. What's the plan? He asked finally, looking up from the display. Hayes and Carter exchanged glances. It was Carter who spoke. That's why you're here, Jim. We need someone who understands tank warfare at a fundamental level. Someone who can anticipate how Baranov might target our armor in a way that creates maximum psychological and political impact. And someone who has personal stakes in ensuring the operation fails, Hayes added bluntly. Hargrove's jaw tightened. You want me to go to Poland? It wasn't a question, but Carter nodded confirmation. As a civilian consultant to review force protection protocols. Your official role would give you access to deployment information without raising flags that might alert Baranov's people. The catch is, Hayes continued, you'll have minimal official support. We can't risk exposing our awareness of Razlom. If Baranov realizes we're onto his operation, he'll simply delay and restructure, potentially making the next attempt even harder to detect. So I'd be operating essentially alone in a foreign country, looking for Russian operatives who are planning to attack American tanks during a NATO exercise, Hargrove summarized, while maintaining the fiction that I'm just there to consult on force protection. Not entirely alone, Carter said, sliding a folder across the table. We have a small team already in place, officially part of the exercise evaluation group. They can provide limited support, but yes, you'd need to maintain your cover while conducting what amounts to a counterintelligence operation. Hargrove opened the folder, scanning its contents. Travel documentation, background on the NATO exercise, and a brief operational plan. And if I find these operatives, I'm not exactly in a position to conduct arrests on Polish soil. Your mission is identification and intelligence gathering only, Hayes stated firmly. Once you've confirmed the threat and its nature, we have specialized teams that can be activated through proper channels. And Michael, does he know about any of this? Carter shook his head. Lieutenant Hargrove has been debriefed about Liberty Falls, but he has no knowledge of the broader Razlom operation or the specific threat to his unit. Operational security is paramount. Hargrove closed the folder, considering the proposal. His military career had ended 5 years ago, yet here he was being drawn back into a shadow war against an adversary who had specifically targeted his son's unit. The professional analysis and personal concern couldn't be separated, not in this case. When do I leave? He asked finally. Tomorrow morning, 0600, Carter replied. Military transport to Ramstein, then commercial flight to Warsaw. You'll rendezvous with our team at the Exercise Coordination Center in Orzish, near the training grounds. Hayes leaned forward, her expression deadly serious. Colonel, I need to emphasize the sensitive nature of this operation. If Baranov has the level of inside access we suspect, any unusual communication or behavior could compromise everything. I understand Operational Security Director, Hargrove replied evenly. What I need to understand is how far I'm authorized to go if I identify an imminent threat to American forces. Carter's answer was measured. You're authorized to take reasonable actions to prevent immediate harm to U.S. personnel. But this is not a license for unilateral action. We need intelligence more than we need heroes. The implication was clear. Observe, report, but don't engage unless absolutely necessary. Standard procedure for this type of deniable operation, but cold comfort when the potential targets included his son. One more thing, Hayes added, sliding a small device across the table. It resembled a standard military watch. Secure communications, single channel, encrypted link to our team. Use it sparingly and only when you're confident you're not being monitored. Hargrove picked up the device, examining it briefly before strapping it to his wrist. Anything else I should know? Just this, Carter said quietly. The Liberty Falls incident was contained before it could achieve its objectives, but it still caused significant damage. 3 American soldiers wounded, millions in equipment destroyed, and a public relations nightmare that's still playing out in congressional hearings. If Baranov succeeds in Poland, the implications go far beyond physical damage. A successful attack on American tanks during a NATO exercise, so close to Russian territory, would reshape the geopolitical landscape, Hargrove finished, potentially fracturing NATO itself depending on how it's spun. Exactly, Hayes confirmed, which is why this operation has to remain completely deniable. If you're compromised, we'll disavow any knowledge of your actual mission. As far as anyone would know, you were simply a consultant who exceeded his authority. It was the standard disclaimer for this type of operation, but the reality of it settled heavily on Hargrove's shoulders. He would be operating without a safety net, pursuing Russian operatives on NATO soil, with his son's life potentially hanging in the balance. I understand, he said simply. I'll find them. The flight to Europe gave Hargrove time to review the materials thoroughly, committing key details to memory before storing the more sensitive documents in a secure pouch that would be returned to diplomatic personnel upon arrival. The NATO exercise, codenamed Atlantic Shield, involved elements from 12 countries, with American forces providing the heavy armor component, 2 tank companies equipped with M1A2 Abrams, supported by mechanized infantry and Bradley fighting vehicles. Michael's company would be operating in the northern sector of the training area, conducting simulated defensive operations against a mock aggressor force composed primarily of Polish and German units. The exercise scenario involved responding to a cross-border incursion, making it particularly sensitive given the actual geographic proximity to Russia. As the military transport touched down at Ramstein Air Base, Hargrove's thoughts shifted from tactical analysis to personal reflection. His relationship with Michael remained strained, despite their cooperation during the Liberty Falls incident. They had parted with a tentative understanding, not reconciliation, but perhaps the beginning of one. Now he would be operating in the shadows around his son's unit, unable to explain his presence or purpose. The commercial flight from Germany to Warsaw was uneventful, allowing Hargrove to blend in with the business travelers and tourists. From there, a nondescript rental car took him north toward the exercise area, driving through the Polish countryside as afternoon faded into evening. The landscape reminded him of certain parts of eastern Ukraine where he'd conducted training missions during his active service. Flat plains giving way to forests of pine and birch, small villages clustered around church spires, and roads that stretched straight toward the horizon. He reached Orzes shortly after dusk, checking into a small hotel near the Military Coordination Center. The town itself showed signs of the increased activity that accompanied major military exercises. More vehicles on the roads, soldiers in various NATO uniforms moving between buildings, and the distant sound of helicopters passing overhead. Hargrove's gay room was simple but clean, with a view overlooking the town square. He placed his luggage on the bed and conducted a quick but thorough sweep for surveillance devices, an old habit from deployments to sensitive areas. Finding nothing obvious, he unpacked the minimum necessary items before securing his room and heading out to make his initial contact. The coordination center occupied a repurposed school building at the edge of town, its perimeter secured by Polish military police who checked identification carefully. Hargrove presented his credentials, the official documentation identifying him as a U.S. Department of Defense consultant conducting a force protection assessment, and was directed to a small office on the second floor. Inside, a woman in civilian clothes sat at a desk covered with maps and logistics reports. Major Rebecca Chen, according to Hargrove's briefing, officially part of the exercise evaluation team, unofficially his primary contact for this operation. She looked up as he entered, recognition flickering in her eyes. "Colonel Hargrove," she greeted him, standing and extending her hand. "Or should I say Mr. Hargrove? I understand you're here to assess our force protection measures." The phrasing confirmed she was aware of his actual mission. "That's right," he replied, shaking her hand. I'm particularly interested in the security protocols for the armored elements. Chen nodded, gesturing for him to take a seat while she closed the door. Once it was secure, her demeanor shifted subtly. We've been expecting you. The situation has developed since your briefing in Washington. In what way? She activated a tablet, keeping the screen angled away from the windows. We've identified unusual activity around the northern exercise area, civilian vehicles conducting what appears to be reconnaissance of approach routes in observation positions. Polish intelligence flagged them as potential security concerns, but without specific evidence of hostile intent. Any pattern to their movements? Hargrove asked, leaning forward to study the tablet. They're focusing on the areas where the American armor will be operating, Chen replied, swiping to show a map with marked positions, particularly these three valleys and the ridgeline that overlooks the main exercise area. Hargrove recognized the tactical significance immediately. The marked positions would provide excellent vantage points for observing or targeting armored movements through the valleys. Classic ambush territory. These were taken yesterday, Chen continued, showing surveillance photographs of three men with professional camera equipment on the ridge. They identified themselves as wildlife photographers to the local police when questioned. Their documentation appears legitimate, but facial recognition matched one of them to a known GRU associate. Have they established any pattern or base of operations? Chen nodded. They're staying at a hunting lodge about 15 kilometers from the exercise area. Very isolated, accessible only by a single dirt road. They arrived 3 days ago, paid cash for 2 weeks. Hargrove considered this information. When does the American armor arrive in the exercise area? First elements began arriving this morning. Your son's company is scheduled for deployment to forward positions tomorrow at 0900. The timeline was accelerating. If Baranov's team followed the same playbook as Kozlov, they would establish observation first, map patterns and vulnerabilities, then position their assets for the actual operations shortly before execution. I need to get eyes on that hunting lodge, Hargrove decided, and I need to understand exactly what route and positions Michael's company will be using. Chen hesitated. The deployment routes are classified. I can access them, but sharing that information outside official channels is exactly what we need to do if we're going to identify the threat, Hargrove finished firmly. I understand the protocols, Major, but if there's a compromise in the command structure, official channels are exactly what we need to avoid. After a moment's consideration, she nodded. I can provide the information, but surveillance of the lodge will be difficult. It's remote, and any unusual activity in the area could alert them. I've conducted reconnaissance in more challenging environments, Hargrove assured her. What I need is transportation that won't attract attention and basic equipment, nothing that can't be sourced locally. I can arrange both, Chen replied. The cover story of a force protection assessment gives you legitimate reason to inspect the exercise area. We can use that to get you close to the lodge without raising suspicions. They spent the next hour developing a plan. Chen would arrange for a four-wheel drive vehicle suitable for the rural terrain and provide Hargrove with the necessary equipment under the guise of standard assessment gear. He would conduct an official inspection of the northern exercise area tomorrow morning, establishing his presence as expected for his cover role, then use that legitimate movement to position himself for surveillance of the hunting lodge. As they finalized the details, Chen asked the question that had likely been on her mind since his arrival. You're taking a significant personal risk, Colonel. Why not leave this to the dedicated counterintelligence teams? Hargrove's answer was simple. Because they're targeting my son's unit, and I have experience these teams don't, direct knowledge of how Kozlov operated at Liberty Falls, and decades of understanding tank vulnerabilities in combat situations. Chen seemed to accept this, though her expression suggested she recognized there was more to it than professional expertise. We have a secure vehicle ready for you at 0700 tomorrow. I've arranged access credentials for all sectors of the exercise area, consistent with your cover role. And the deployment details for the American armor? She handed him a sealed envelope. Memorize and destroy, nothing written down, nothing transmitted electronically. Hargrove took the envelope and stood to leave. I'll make initial contact at 1300 tomorrow to report findings. If I discover actionable intelligence before then, I'll use the secure channel. As he turned to go, Chen added, Colonel, the Russians have demonstrated they're willing to use lethal force to achieve their objectives. If these are Baranov's people and they identify you as a threat, I know exactly what they're capable of, Major, Hargrove replied. I've seen it firsthand. The night passed quickly as Hargrove studied maps of the area and memorized the deployment routes for Michael's company. By dawn, he had developed a mental model of the exercise terrain, identifying the most likely points where Baranov's team might position themselves to observe or interfere with American armor. The vehicle Chen had arranged was waiting as promised, a slightly weathered Land Rover that wouldn't attract attention in the rural Polish landscape. In the back, concealed within cases marked as environmental monitoring equipment, were the tools he would need: high-resolution binoculars, a thermal imaging scope, secure communication gear, and a compact camera with telephoto lens. Hargrove began his day following his cover story, visiting the exercise command post and reviewing force protection protocols with the security officer, a necessary step to maintain his official reason for being in the area. He took notes, asked appropriate questions, and generally played the role of the meticulous consultant while mentally marking the clock toward the real operation. By mid-morning, he had established his professional presence sufficiently to move freely through the exercise area. American tanks had begun arriving overnight, transported by heavy equipment trailers to their initial positions. From a distance, Hargrove observed the massive Abrams tanks being offloaded, their crews conducting preliminary checks and establishing communications with the command elements. He spotted Michael supervising the positioning of his platoon's tanks, directing them into a tree line that offered concealment from aerial observation. Even from this distance, Hargrove could recognize his son's methodical approach, the same attention to tactical positioning that he had demonstrated during the Liberty Falls incident. The temptation to approach was strong, but Hargrove resisted. Any unusual contact could compromise both his mission and potentially alert Baranov's people if they were monitoring command personnel. Instead, he continued his official inspection route, working his way gradually toward the northern sector where the hunting lodge was located. By early afternoon, Hargrove had positioned himself on a wooded hillside approximately 2 kilometers from the lodge. Through his binoculars, he could observe the modest 2-story building and its surroundings. A black SUV and a rugged pickup truck were parked outside, and occasional movement visible through the windows confirmed the building was occupied. For 3 hours, he maintained his observation, documenting the comings and goings of 4 men, all with military bearing despite their civilian clothes. They periodically checked equipment in the vehicles and conducted what appeared to be communications checks, behavior consistent with an operational team rather than genuine hunters or photographers. The most telling activity came shortly before dusk. 2 of the men unloaded several long, hard-sided cases from the pickup and carried them into the lodge. The cases were the right size and configuration for man-portable missile systems, likely anti-tank weapons similar to those Kozlov had positioned near Liberty Falls. As darkness approached, Hargrove retreated to his vehicle and made his scheduled contact with Chen using the secure communication device. 4 individuals confirmed at the location, likely hostile based on observed behavior and equipment. They've moved what appear to be weapons cases into the building within the last hour. "Can you confirm Russian affiliation?" Chen asked, her voice slightly distorted by the encryption. "Not definitively, but their operational profile matches Kozlov's team exactly. Civilian cover, military bearing, specialized equipment consistent with an anti-armor mission. Their location provides excellent access to the route American tanks will use tomorrow morning." There was a brief pause before Chen responded. "That's concerning but not definitive evidence to justify official action. We need more." "I'm going to continue surveillance through the night," Hargrove decided. "If they're planning to move against the tanks tomorrow, they'll need to position their assets tonight or early morning." "That's high risk," Chen cautioned. "If they detect you, it's necessary," Hargrove cut in firmly. "I'll maintain distance and use passive observation only." After signing off, Hargrove prepared for a night surveillance operation. He moved his vehicle to a concealed position half a kilometer away, then hiked back to an observation point with better coverage of the approach roads. The thermal scope would allow him to track movement even in complete darkness. The night passed slowly. Around 2300 hours, 2 men left the lodge in the pickup truck, driving toward the exercise area. Hargrove tracked them until they turned onto a small forest road that led to one of the ridgelines overlooking the valley where Michael's company would be passing tomorrow. Unable to follow both groups simultaneously, Hargrove made the tactical decision to maintain observation on the lodge while noting the direction and timing of the pickup's departure. If this followed Kozlov's operational pattern, the men would be conducting final reconnaissance and possibly positioning forward equipment. His patience was rewarded shortly after midnight when the pickup returned. The men unloaded several items from the truck, equipment bags, and what appeared to be a portable communications array. Their movements had the practiced efficiency of military operators, confirming Hargrove's assessment that these were not civilian hunters. By 0200, activity at the lodge had ceased, lights dimming as the occupants presumably rested before whatever operation they had planned. Hargrove used this opportunity to circle around to the vehicles, approaching with extreme caution through the surrounding forest. The SUV was locked, its windows tinted to prevent observation of the interior. The pickup, however, had been less carefully secured, perhaps due to the late hour of its return. Hargrove examined it closely, using a penlight to illuminate the bed without risking wider visibility. What he found confirmed his suspicions: residue of soil and vegetation that matched the ridge area, mounting brackets that could support weapon systems, and most tellingly, a receipt fallen between the seats from a local hardware store listing wire, batteries, and remote triggers, components consistent with improvised detonation systems. Hargrove documented these findings with his camera, then retreated back to his observation position. The evidence was mounting, but still circumstantial. Without catching them in possession of actual weapons or direct evidence of hostile intent, official intervention remained problematic. Dawn approached with no further activity from the lodge. At 0600, Hargrove made contact with Chen again, updating her on his observations and findings. They've conducted reconnaissance of the Iraq route the American armor will use and acquired components consistent with remote detonation systems. The pattern matches Kozlov's preparation exactly. It's still not enough, Chen replied, frustration evident in her voice. Polish authorities need definitive evidence before they can move against foreign nationals on their soil. And we can't redirect the American tanks without revealing we're aware of a potential threat, which could compromise the entire counter-operation. Hargrove considered their options, knowing the clock was ticking. According to the deployment schedule, Michael's company would begin moving through the valley in less than 3 hours. What if we force their hand, he suggested. Create a situation that compels them to reveal their intentions. What do you have in mind? I need a vehicle matching the profile of a command element, something they would identify as a high-value target, but not so obvious that it would alert them to our awareness. Chen was quiet for a moment, considering. I could arrange for a communications vehicle to conduct a terrain survey along that route ahead of the main armor movement. It would appear to be standard pre-exercise reconnaissance. Make it happen, Hargrove decided, and ensure the actual personnel are minimized. If I'm wrong about this, there's no harm done. If I'm right, you're putting yourself directly in harm's way, Chen finished. Better me than a company of tanks with no warning. Within an hour, Chen had arranged for a Humvee with communications equipment to be placed at Hargrove's disposal, officially for his force protection assessment. The vehicle was distinctive enough to potentially attract attention from anyone monitoring for command elements, but not so unusual as to appear suspicious for his cover role. Hargrove drove directly to the valley route, timing his approach to precede Michael's company by approximately 90 minutes. If Baranov's team was planning an attack, this would present them with a choice: either reveal their position by engaging this unexpected target, or risk missing what might appear to be a commanding officer conducting a final road check. As he navigated the rural road that wound through the forested valley, Hargrove maintained constant vigilance, scanning the ridgelines where his night observations had suggested the team might position themselves. The morning sun was still low, casting long shadows that could conceal observation posts or firing positions. Halfway through the valley, at a point where the road curved alongside a steep embankment, Hargrove spotted the first definitive evidence. A thin wire stretched across the road at vehicle height, nearly invisible unless you were specifically looking for it. It wasn't sufficient to stop a vehicle, but it could certainly trigger a detonation system. Hargrove stopped the Humvee short of the wire and exited cautiously, keeping the vehicle between himself and the ridgeline. Using binoculars, he scanned the opposite slope, looking for the telltale signs of an observation position or weapons emplacement. There, a subtle reflection of glass or metal among the trees, approximately 200 meters up the slope. Someone was watching the road, likely with optics similar to his own. Hargrove reached for the secure communication device, preparing to alert Chen to his findings, when the decision was made for him. A distinctive sound cut through the morning air, the launch signature of a man-portable anti-tank missile. Hargrove dove for cover as the missile streaked toward the Humvee, impacting with a thunderous explosion that shattered the morning stillness. The Humvee erupted in flames, the force of the blast throwing debris in all directions. Hargrove, protected by the roadside embankment, felt the heat wash over him as secondary explosions from the vehicle's fuel tank sent black smoke billowing into the sky. From his position, he could see movement on the ridge, two figures repositioning, likely assessing the effectiveness of their strike. They would be looking for confirmation of casualties, possibly preparing to verify their target or collect evidence of the attack's success. Hargrove keyed the secure communication device. Contact. Anti-tank missile fired at my vehicle in grid sector Delta 7. Two hostiles confirmed on Northeast Ridge. Immediate response required. Chen's reply was immediate. Strike team deploying ETA 5 minutes. American armor has been notified to hold position. Can you confirm hostile identity? Hostile force confirmed, Hargrove replied, watching as the figures on the ridge began moving toward the road. They're approaching to verify the target. Appears to be the same team from the lodge. Understood. Maintain observation but do not engage unless necessary for self-defense. Polished special forces are en route by helicopter. Hargrove acknowledged and settled deeper into his covered position. The two men were descending the slope rapidly, rifles visible in their hands, not bothering to maintain their civilian photographer cover now that they had committed to the attack. From their approach angle, they had not yet spotted him separated from the burning vehicle. As they reached the road, Hargrove could hear fragments of their conversation. Russian, confirming his suspicions about their origin. They approached the burning Humvee cautiously, weapons ready, clearly looking for the occupant they expected to find. One of them spoke into a radio, likely reporting to the others at the lodge, or possibly to additional elements positioned elsewhere in the area. The other began circling the wreckage, growing increasingly agitated as he failed to locate a body. Hargrove remained motionless, controlling his breathing as years of combat experience took over. The distance was too great for accurate pistol fire, and engaging now would only alert them to his position, while potentially prompting a larger response from their companions. Better to wait for the strike team, now just minutes away. The sound of approaching helicopters changed the equation. The Russians heard it too, their heads turning toward the sound. They exchanged rapid words, then began retreating toward the ridge, abandoning their search in favor of escape. Hargrove faced a split-second decision: allow them to potentially escape and warn their colleagues, or reveal his position to delay them until the strike team arrived. The memory of Liberty Falls, of Kozlov's operation that had threatened Michael and countless others, made the choice clear. He emerged from cover, pistol raised. "Stop, U.S. military! Drop your weapons!" The Russians spun toward his voice, surprise if it and in their expressions before training took over. The closer one dropped to a firing position while the other sought cover behind the burning Humvee. Hargrove fired twice, forcing them to keep their heads down rather than trying to hit them at this distance. "Last chance," he shouted. "Drop the weapons or the helicopters will engage." For a moment it seemed they might surrender, the odds clearly against them. Then the distinctive sound of an approaching vehicle came from the direction they had been retreating toward. The SUV from the lodge appeared at the top of the ridge, providing them potential extraction. Both Russians broke cover simultaneously, firing suppressing bursts toward Hargrove's position as they sprinted toward the waiting vehicle. Hargrove returned fire, aiming to disable rather than kill, but the distance and their rapid movement made accurate shooting nearly impossible. The helicopters were visible now, two Polish military craft racing toward the scene. The Russians reached their vehicle just as the lead helicopter crested the ridge. One of them raised what appeared to be a shoulder-launched weapon, another anti-tank missile, potentially capable of downing the helicopter. Hargrove steadied himself against a tree trunk, aimed carefully, and fired 3 rapid shots. The distance was extreme for a pistol, but one round found its mark. The Russian with the missile launcher staggered, the weapon falling unfired as he collapsed beside the SUV. The remaining Russians dragged their wounded companion into the vehicle and accelerated away, skidding on the uneven terrain as they fled deeper into the forest. The helicopters altered course to pursue, banking sharply as they passed over Hargrove's position. Minutes later, ground vehicles arrived, the quick reaction force Chen had mobilized. Polish special forces secured the scene while medical personnel checked Hargrove for injuries. The burning Humvee continued to smolder, a stark reminder of how close the attack had come to succeeding. "Are you hit?" a Polish officer asked in accented English, examining Hargrove's dust-covered appearance. No, Hargrove replied, still watching the ridgeline where the helicopters had disappeared in pursuit. But we need to secure that lodge immediately. There may be additional operatives and equipment there. The officer nodded, already coordinating with his team via radio. As the Polish forces established a perimeter, Hargrove's secure communication device activated. Chen's voice came through clearly, despite the background noise of the operation. "Colonel, what's your status?" "Operational," Hargrove replied. Two hostiles fled in an SUV, being pursued by the helicopters. One wounded. They fired an anti-tank missile at my vehicle, confirming hostile intent. "Any word on the main element at the lodge?" "Polish forces secured it 5 minutes ago," Chen reported. Two individuals taken into custody. Substantial evidence recovered, including additional missiles and electronic warfare equipment. Preliminary analysis suggests they were planning to target the entire tank company as it moved through the valley. Hargrove felt a cold certainty settle over him. Just like Liberty Falls. Create chaos, target high-value assets, generate maximum political impact. Exactly, and thanks to you, we stopped it before it began. Chen's voice shifted slightly. There's something else you should know. We've received word that the SUV crashed during the pursuit. One occupant was killed, the other captured. The survivor has confirmed they were operating under Baranov's orders as part of Operation Razlom. The news should have brought satisfaction. Confirmation that his assessment had been correct, that the threat had been neutralized. Instead, Hargrove felt only a weary relief that Michael and his company had been spared the attack. "What about the tanks?" he asked. "Rerouted to an alternate approach. Your son's company is safe, though they don't know why their orders were changed." Hours later, after debriefing with Polish authorities and NATO command, Hargrove stood on the ridge overlooking the valley where the attack had been planned. The area was now secured, with investigation teams processing evidence and reconstructing the plot that had nearly succeeded. From this vantage point, he could see the full tactical picture, how the Russians had selected the perfect ambush position, how vulnerable the American tanks would have been moving through the narrow valley, and how devastating the political consequences could have been if they had succeeded. "Colonel Hargrove." He turned to find Michael approaching, still in his tanker's uniform, expression a mix of confusion and grim understanding. Someone had connected the dots for him then. "Lieutenant," Hargrove acknowledged formally, unsure how much his son had been told. Michael stopped beside him, looking out over the valley. "They briefed me on what happened. Said you uncovered a plot targeting our company." He paused, searching for words. "They said you put yourself directly in the line of fire to expose it." Hargrove shrugged slightly. "I was in the right position with the right experience." "That's not what I heard," Michael replied, a hint of the old tension returning to his voice. "I heard you specifically requested this mission when intelligence identified the threat to my unit, that you've been working this case since Liberty Falls." There seemed little point in denial. "Baranov, the Russian commander behind all this, specifically targeted your company as part of a larger operation. I couldn't stand by and let that happen." Michael was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had softened. 5 years of silence after you retired. 5 years of thinking you'd moved on from both the military and your family. Then Liberty Falls happens, and suddenly you're diving into burning buildings and chasing Russian operatives across Poland. "The circumstances were exceptional," Hargrove offered carefully. "Were they?" Michael asked, turning to face his father directly. "Or were you just waiting for a mission important enough to come back for?" The question cut deeper than Hargrove expected, laying bare the conflict that had driven them apart years ago. His dedication to the mission, to the tanks, had always come first, until now when the mission and his son had become inseparable. "I came back for you," Hargrove admitted finally. "Not for the mission, not for the tanks, for you." Something shifted in Michael's expression. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps understanding. "They're moving us to a secure base pending further investigation. Whole companies been pulled from the exercise." "Sensible precaution," Hargrove nodded. "Baranov's network might be more extensive than what we've uncovered so far." "That's what I told my XO," Michael replied with the ghost of a smile. "He thought it was overkill. Apparently, I inherited your paranoia along with the tank expertise." The moment of levity was unexpected but welcome. Hargrove allowed himself a small smile in return. Situational awareness, and it served you well so far. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching as the investigation teams worked below. Finally, Michael spoke again, his tone measured. "When this is over, When my company is secure and the immediate threat is handled, we should talk. Really talk, not just about missions and tactics. Hargrove nodded, something tight in his chest loosening slightly. I'd like that. Good. Michael checked his watch. I need to get back to my unit. We're moving out in 30 minutes. As he turned to go, Hargrove called after him. Michael? His son paused, looking back. Your tanks performed well at Liberty Falls. Good tactical positioning, effective fire discipline. You've built a strong company. Michael's expression softened momentarily, the professional acknowledgement clearly meaning something to him despite their personal history. I had a good foundation to build on. As Hargrove watched his son walk away, returning to his unit and his responsibilities, he felt a complex mixture of emotions. Pride in Michael's capabilities and leadership, regret for the years of distance between them, and hope that perhaps this shared crucible, facing Kozlov at Liberty Falls and now Baranov in Poland, had forged a path toward reconciliation. Chen appeared beside him, tablet in hand displaying preliminary reports. The Polish authorities have officially classified this as a thwarted terrorist attack. The NATO command is deliberating on the appropriate response given the Russian connection. And Baranov? Hargrove asked. Still at large, but his operation is compromised. We've identified 2 more cells operating in Europe, likely part of the same Razlom framework. Counterintelligence teams are moving to neutralize them. Hargrove nodded, his gaze still following Michael's retreating figure. What happens now? Officially? You complete your force protection assessment with commendations for alerting authorities to suspicious activity that led to the prevention of a terrorist incident. Then you return to the U.S. for comprehensive debriefing. And unofficially, Chen's expression was measured. There may be additional operations requiring your expertise as we unravel Baranov's network. The intelligence community values officers who can operate effectively in these gray areas. The implication was clear: a path back to service, albeit in a different capacity than his previous tank command. A way to continue protecting American forces and interests, perhaps even working directly to counter the threat that Baranov represented. Under different circumstances, it might have been tempting. But as he watched Michael climb into a waiting vehicle, Hargrove knew his priorities had finally, belatedly aligned. I appreciate the consideration, he replied, but I think I've fulfilled my obligation to the Tank Corps. There are other responsibilities I've neglected for too long. Chen seemed to understand, nodding slightly. Family should come first, Colonel, something we forget too often in this line of work. As the sun began to set over the Polish countryside, Hargrove remained on the ridge, watching as Michael's company moved out in precise formation, their tanks powerful and purposeful against the landscape. The immediate threat had been neutralized, though he harbored no illusions that Baranov would simply abandon his operations. There would be other battles, other challenges, but for now the tanks rolled on, their iron harvest a bounty of security rather than destruction. And perhaps more importantly, the first tentative shoots of reconciliation had broken through the long, fallow ground between father and son, a different kind of harvest, but one that Hargrove finally recognized as infinitely more valuable than any military victory.